described citizen driven. All of us who have worked to bring this festival out are people from within your all friend circles. We are all citizens and volunteers who have brought this out. This has been an extremely satisfying festival. What the last 2 days have been. Fantastic, a great lineup of speakers, events, talks, discussions, and an amazing audience. It's great to do this HLF. Thank you. HLF rock! Come rain or sunshine, HLF goes on!
Good morning, viewers. Welcome to the third day of the Hyderabad Literary Festival. Since today is January 30th, we pay our homage to the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, by playing the national anthem, followed by Abide With Me.
Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Swift to its close ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. I need thy presence every passing hour. Walk with me. I fear no foe, with thee at hand to bless. Ills have no weight, and tears no bitterness. Where is that sting? Where great thy victory? I triumph still if thou abide with me. Hold thou thy cross, bear before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. With me in life, in death, O Lord, abide with me. Abide with me. Abide with me.
Welcome to today's session on food and memory with Chef Anahita Dhondy and Chitrita Banerji. In this culinary session, we can cook up a bouquet of aromas and remembered relationships and savor them. Talking to both these people is Ratna Rao Shekar. Ratna is the author of several books, including a book of short stories called Purple Lotus and Other Stories, and more recently, a book on India's leading artist, Lakshma Gaud. She has been a journalist for over 30 years, launching and helming several magazines. She is currently editor of Hyderabad City magazine, Wow Hyderabad. Now for the authors, one a debutant and other a much published author. Anahita Dhondy is the former chef partner of Soda Bottle Opener Wala, the Bombay Irani cafe and bar chain that promotes Parsi cuisine. A passionate cook since the age of 10 and a Le Cordon Bleu Grand Diplôme holder, she has won several awards and accolades, including featuring on the Forbes 30 Under 30 Asia List 2019. Parsi Kitchen, a memoir of food and family 2021, is her first book. Chitrita Banerji is a Bengali American writer who examines the relationships between memory, history, culture, religion, and food in her works. She is the author of several books on Indian food and culture, including Eating India and Odyssey into the Food and Culture of the Land of Spices, listed among the best new food books of 2008 by Time Out London. Her work has been included in Best American Travel Writing 2006. Her other work includes the novel Mirror City 2014 and the biography Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, The Story of Bengal's Greatest Bhakti Saint 2018. She is a member of the board of the Culinary Historians of Boston. Now for a brief description about the books. Parsi Kitchen, a memoir of food and family, is Anahita Dhondy's debut book. The Parsi Kitchen is a warm and whimsical memoir about how Anahita embraced the cuisine that she grew up with. From her grandmother's ravo to a Bombay duck inspired by her travels through Gujarat, the quirky tales behind her beloved dishes makes for a delicious read. Her book is not just a recipe book, she says, and I quote her from an interview. It is a book of stories. Each chapter has a story that goes into a recipe. It offers insight into the culture and community. A treasure trove of recipes and memories, The Parsi Kitchen is a book to be savored. I request Anahita to please show the book to the viewers. Now for Chitrita's book, A Taste of My Life, a memoir in essays and recipes from a two-time winner of a Sophie Co Award in food history. One of the most celebrated culinary historians of our time, Chitrita Banerji grew up in a Calcutta home devoted to food. From there, she went to Harvard as a graduate student, then to Dhaka soon after the 1971 India-Pakistan War, and later returned to US, the passage of these years inspiring a fecund writing career. In this memoir, styled like a three-course meal with an ironic twist, she offers an absorbing portrait of a life that has intermingled with food in moving and unexpected ways. Through vividly evoked repasts with her family and other meaningful gastronomic encounters in settings both personal and political, Banerji reveals how food has played a defining role in her experiences of love, adventure, conflict, loss, and reconciliation. In the process, she introduces us to those dishes and drinks that are most special to her. Kadam Bhai's duck bhuna, her father's favorite tea, winter treats such as Narkel Naru, a chicken sandwich from memory land, and charms us throughout with her sublime and enchanting prose. I now request Chitrita to please hold up the book for our viewers. Thank you. Over to you, Ratna. The session is yours.
Good morning, ladies. Good morning, Anahita, Chitrita.
Good morning.
Good morning from Hyderabad. Before I get on to the questions, I wanted to ask both of you why you wrote books, especially you call yourself a chef, Anahita. What made you want to document your story?
Honestly, I feel that, being a chef, we're always around food, where, every single day it's an experience, it's exhilarating because, we're in a kitchen where there's a lot of food being made and, lots of orders coming in and out. And honestly, you can't think of a book. So the idea of a book didn't come to me when I was working in a restaurant kitchen. It actually came to me when someone asked me about the history of a particular Parsi dish. And then that's when I realized that, we really don't have too much documentation of regional Indian recipes. You might find a lot of generic recipes. You might find, stories and history about certain dishes. But a lot of Parsi recipes in particular, I saw that there wasn't enough documentation for it. So I took that up as a challenge, saying that, I'm a chef who's promoting regional food and it is my own home cooked food. So I should take out the time to, write a book and share this with people in the community and outside the community. Because, like Kinara earlier said, she said that, it's not just a cookbook, it's a storybook. And I wanted people to kind of get an insight into the community and understand it could be day-to-day life, or it could be just a special ingredient. It could be, the story of a recipe. And I wanted that insight. I wanted people to get that insight.
And Chitrita, I'm not sure what you went to Harvard for, what degree, but why did you become a historian?
I got my master's degree in English literature, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So I became a culinary historian, not a general historian. Almost accidentally. This was 30 years ago when a British publisher, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, asked me to write a book on Bengali cuisine specifically and its interrelationship with Bengali culture. Because they were doing a series called the Life and Food series. So this would be Life and Food in Bengal. I decided to, as Anahita says, a challenge comes to you and you decide to take it up. I had never done any food writing. I was always interested in food because of the family I came from, where food was a very big thing. And I'm the daughter of a mother who was a legendary cook. So interest in food was something natural for me. But studying the history of my region, Bengal, and being able to take both Bengals together, West Bengal and the country of Bangladesh, I felt that I had a perspective which some of the other books in the series didn't have. There were life and food books written by outsiders about different parts of the world. So this book would be the first one written by a person who belonged to that region. And so in a way, you can say I started a journey not knowing what I was going to find. And I ended up being so fascinated that I never really stopped. I finished that book and I just continued, delving into the history and the culture of a, region that is, incredibly rich in food diversity, but also has a very complex history of, religion, as well as, material prosperity, and then colonial experience, all kinds of things. And they were all interrelated to the region's food. And it's a fascinating discovery. I'm still discovering it. I'm by no means done with it. But that's how I started. Not because, I was a historian.
Both of you have written about regional cuisines, the cuisines, like Anahita, you said you went to Cordon Bleu and there you discovered you were craving for Parsi ingredients and spices. So is that the way forward? I think there's a resurgence of regional foods in India currently. Do you people feel that?
I mean, there's a
Yes, very
huge
much.
trend currently, and over, the last 5 years, I have seen a huge trend, at least in the restaurant industry, where we've seen a lot of regional Indian, if not particularly regional Indian restaurants, but even in menus, I have seen that, there's more research, there's more often excitement and introduction to regional Indian ingredients and recipes. So, it's very nice because, Indian food was earlier just categorized as South Indian and North Indian, and
Yeah.
yeah, and East Indian and West Indian, and, British, and, it was not really being celebrated for its regionality. And honestly, I've seen chefs in the industry, and, being part of that group of chefs in the last 8, 10 years, we've seen this huge boom of people being more interested in their own regional cuisines and being proud of it. And even in my book, in the Parsi Kitchen, there's a chapter called the Pork Vindaloo, which is exactly what you said. When I was in London, I was craving my own food, and I realized that, all the fancy cuisine in the world and all the most beautiful presentations and, the garnishes and whatever I might be learning, I did learn a lot. But it never satisfied me to the core, which, when you go home and you eat dal chawal, or you might eat your pickle, which is your grandmom's pickle, there's a certain amount of satisfaction that you get. There's a certain amount of, like, in your heart, you just feel warm and you feel good. And I think that's what your own home food will do for you. And there are so many stories in the book like that, and I feel like everyone together is working to promote regional Indian food, and I'm so happy to see that, and I hope it continues even more.
In fact, in Hyderabad now, we don't have just the Hyderabad biryani, but there's Rayalaseema, Telangana,
Yes,
Andhra.
absolutely.
Being
Absolutely.
fine-tuned further.
Yes, and I'm sure now even more, because they'll find small pockets and small
Yeah,
villages and small areas which
yeah,
have their own type of biryani.
yeah,
And it's not about what is better, Lucknow or Hyderabadi or Avdi or whatever. Everyone has their own different flavor, spices, ingredients, and we have to respect that. We have to say, okay, we want to eat a Hyderabadi biryani today, and tomorrow we might enjoy a Lucknowi biryani. It's fine. So it's
even in
beforehand.
Hyderabad, there's a Telangana biryani now, not
I
just
know.
Hyderabadi, that old
Exactly.
Hyderabad.
So Telangana biryani, exactly. So what I'm saying is that you don't have to choose which is my favorite. Usually they always ask you, right? Which is your favorite biryani? We have such a diverse
I
culture.
know.
We have so many different types of, making biryani, even the rice grain actually.
Yeah.
So yes.
And Chitrita, what do you feel? And how do we document? I don't know how much of it is authentic. So, we need to document the older recipes, the authentic recipes. What do you think, Chitrita? How is this
Um,
to be
you
done?
know, I will say that, authenticity is a tricky word as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the lessons that I learned when I did all the traveling and the research for my book on eating India was that, what is authentic today was not authentic, 500 years ago. Just think of the ingredients that have come in, that we use so frequently now, which didn't exist in the country 500 years ago. The outsiders like the Portuguese and the Dutch brought in items that have now become part of our cooking. So, what is authentic? I've read medieval Bengali recipes, not a hint of a chili pepper in it or a single piece of potato in it, because those things didn't exist. However, at this point, I'm speaking as somebody who is living outside. So I cannot, say that, I have an enormous expertise on exactly how things are in India the way Anahita does, because, she's right there. Nevertheless, during my visits, and so far I've visited, pretty frequently until this pandemic hit, and I've not been able to travel. I have been really delighted to see that over the years there is, certainly in Bengal, a great resurgence of interest in recipes and ways of cooking and ways of eating that were almost forgotten. There is a great desire to, rediscover and revive the food culture that we had and combine it, and then maybe do something innovative with it that fits our modern palate, which has been expanded by, the tastes of the outside world. And so I think this is a very exciting time to be cooking and eating in India, but also a very, very exciting time for those who are researching and documenting what has been, what is, and what will be, the whole gamut of, food experience. So I would just say it again, from my personal point of view, it's a journey of a nation and a region that I'm watching with, great interest. And I just think it is, not static at all. It's really moving, which is a wonderful thing to watch.
Anahita, do you think the youngsters are going back after eating pastas and whatever, Chinese and everything? They want to eat their own khichdi or, like a Bengali khichdi or an Andhra khichdi. Is that the trend now, you think? I mean, are you seeing that? Because
Yeah, so honestly, I feel like there's a good balance currently, even though it's very easy, for a youngster or anyone to kind of fall for a pasta or a pizza. It's very, very tricky, that situation. But I do see that there is, a little bit of, I would say, interest and enthusiasm to at least learn those basic things, like you said, khichdi. So even during the COVID waves that have come, the first two waves, on social media, I have literally gone back to some really simple recipes which I've just been sharing, and I didn't think that it would be of interest to people. I honestly thought only the fancy ones, or which have lots of technique, or which look beautiful, and that's the only thing that people would kind of try at home or get excited about. But simple khichdi, I did a COVID recovery series with just little bit of chicken soup, how to make like a basic really nice chicken broth, and how to make kada or how to make khichdi. And thousands of people have literally saved those recipes and made them. So I feel like there's a great balance, and people are interested, and you will have a pasta today, and you might have a bajre ki khichdi tomorrow with ghee to, and that balance is very good and very important. And I do see a lot of young people moving that way.
actually, talking of the COVID and lockdown, I think that made a lot of us cooks and curious about cooking because we didn't have anything else to do except reading and probably cooking.
Yeah, so all the chefs
There
were
was
busy
not
at
a lot of
home.
comfort, I think, at that point.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think, just a good hot meal just brings you so much happiness.
No, but the people started cooking as well.
Yes, and a great
Yes.
amount of interest in people to kind of, get into the kitchen and try different things and experiment different, with different things as
And of
well.
course, put pictures on Instagram immediately
Yes, absolutely.
before eating it. So food is very much related to not just a physical well-being, but a mental well-being as well, you think? It's all tied to that because it did bring comfort during
Yes,
COVID.
absolutely.
Chitrita, I'm not sure of the situation in the US, but in India, people were just cooking away.
It's the same here. I mean, every newspaper has been documenting this, how
Yeah,
much
yeah,
people have gone back to home cooking
yeah,
and how much they have now become interested in, learning new things. Not just, very fancy things
yeah,
that
yeah.
you get in a restaurant, but very basic things which they didn't know. And it has provided a great deal of, sustenance and comfort
Comfort,
during
I think, yeah.
a really terrible time.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
you know, I mean, the pandemic has taken more lives in the US than probably, any other place. It's been a terrible time to live through for us. And cooking, I've always felt, if you can, not that everybody has to cook. I don't mean to be, dogmatic about it, but if you can, cooking can be very therapeutic. It
Therapeutic.
doesn't necessarily just, it's not necessarily an act that you go through in order to fill your stomach or to feed your family. It's also something that releases many tensions inside you, and it brings a kind of joy that connects you to other joyful elements in your life. And I believe that more and more people, once they had the leisure to stay home and to
Yeah, I
do
think
things for themselves, realize this, and that has led to this, great outburst of, interest in cooking and learning new recipes and looking at the world and see what else is there beyond the, some beyond the things that I've always eaten in my country. And again, it's a journey that has been imposed on people by the pandemic. I'm not saying that the pandemic was any good, but it's something that has helped people develop in a different way. And I can only say, that's great. That's something that, I totally feel enlarges your perspective and brings you, more introspection and understanding about life. I've always felt, life and food are so interconnected. It's not just, the cooking or being in the kitchen is something separate from the rest of your life. Really, it isn't. It's all interconnected. And I think the pandemic has made many people realize that very much.
So both your books are about nostalgia and memory. So is food tied to what you have eaten, like the sandwich you spoke about, which you used to eat in Bengal? Because that kind of sandwich which I ate here in Hyderabad, I can never get anywhere in the world. I think
That's
Anahita
right.
also speaks about the chai, I think, right? Your favorite.
Yes.
It's also
Yes.
so much about memory, like what we have eaten at home, what our parents have made. Is food also tied to this? I think both your premise is that.
Yes, I feel that, not only is it just a direct memory of, I ate this, but then it leads to other things, and that changes as you go through life. So I may remember something that my mother cooked for me when I was, say, 15 years old, and how much I enjoyed it. That's a very, simple memory. But then as I grow older, I have complex layerings of memory, as like what was happening in the house then, what was our relationship, because, say at the age of 15, I was a terrible teenager, always arguing with my parents and not listening to, what to them, and not doing what I was supposed to do, not studying as hard as I was supposed to do. So all those things come back to you, and then you appreciate the bonding and the patience and the love that you get from your parent through the act of remembering a particular food that you ate that was made for you. So I think, it's a kind of, as I've said before, it's a nostalgia is not something very simple. It is a kind of circular process in time and memory. And as life goes on, you probably, do that more and more. And food is a big part, a big element that, is part of it, part of that nostalgic remembering.
Anahita, your book is full of memories of what various relatives cooked, parents cooked. So, I mean, did you want to document all this? Because yours is quite personal journey, I think. It's not just recipes or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. So, when I was writing the book, it did take me some time. It took me about 5 years. We signed the contract in 2016, and in 2020, we actually had everything ready. But the first 2 years, apologies for that, the first 2 years were really difficult for me to kind of put my thoughts together. Not an author, always in the kitchen. It's just a very busy lifestyle, and when you have to sit and write, you really have to take out time to kind
Yeah.
of do that. And I did, come up with two different scripts completely, and I just wasn't happy with them. And those were more on the lines of an introduction into the cuisine, very, very, structured. And when I went through it, I just wasn't happy with it. So I literally, discarded those two scripts, and I worked on a more personal story, because I felt like every recipe that I have come across, I've eaten, or I have from my memory, which I want to share, they all have a story, and they have a story which is interlinked to a certain person. It could be from my childhood, it could be from, recent years, it could be from my travels. And if you pick up the book, any chapter that you open, you can start reading from anywhere. It's not interlinked.
Yeah.
And I wanted that. So I wanted that, if you pick it up, you read the chapter, and the chapter goes into the recipe, which is the final recipe. So it kind of builds up, and you're interested, and you're excited, and you're like, okay, finally, this is what the dish looks. This is how the dish, this is the recipe for it. And food and nostalgia is something that is so interlinked. I feel like that memory of eating is not just the flavor. It's also so many other things around you. You know, it could be the smells, it could be how cold the weather is, it could be the table that you're sitting on, which might be your grandfather's, it could be the crockery that you're using. I mean, there are so many little elements which heighten your entire experience, and you will not remember each and every,
Yeah.
meal that you've had, but there are some meals that impact you and they will always, be there with you. So I feel like food and nostalgia are so interlinked, and they're very important to put down on paper, because when you read it, you kind of go back into that moment, and that's what, brings a smile to your face, or it could bring tears to your eyes. So either of the two.
Do both of you want to talk about a food memory which you cherish? Anything? Chitrita, you want to go first? She just spoke.
Um,
Any favorite food memory? And I just love that bit about your mother cooking for your husband, East Bengal. I just love that part about your book. So is there anything you want to recall which your mother might have made? Or
Oh yeah, I mean, she was always cooking. I mean, she worked full time. I want to make that very clear. She was not a housewife. She was not a full-time stay-at-home mother. She couldn't be. But she was always the cook in the family. We did not have a hired cook. And also for the extended family, when special occasions came about, my mother was always demanded as the cook, because she was, such a great cook. But some of my memories are not really about fantastic things that she made, but let's say just, one thing that she made. And some of the things that I can't make, and I deeply regret that I did not learn to make them from her. And these are the, very typical homemade Bengali sweets. We particularly associated them with the winter. Makar Sankranti is a time, in middle of January, when Bengalis will always make these, homemade pitas. And they are really a very long part of our cooking tradition in Bengal. They're made with indigenous items, nothing foreign there. So it's, flour, rice flour, coconut, gur, which is jaggery from the date palms, and some fruits maybe. And my mother was an absolute wizard. And I still remember one time when, Makar Sankranti was not a holiday from school or anything. And I still remember one time I came back home from college very late. I had a tutorial, and it took a long time to finish. And I came back home. It was almost 8:30 at night. And I was very hungry, very tired, and I was wondering, well, what will I find? And I found on the table, my mother had already laid out different kinds of these pitas. But she also knew that I liked something else, which had nothing to do with Makar Sankranti, but which was one of my favorite things. It's a sweet called jibe gaja, which is made with just, flour and sugar and dipped in syrup. But it's crispy, but if it's made by the right person, it's both crispy and it melts in the mouth. It is an amazing texture. And she had made that for me too. And so when I looked, and I know that I was, big grin spread over my face, seeing that. She said, somehow I knew today that just making the Shankranti pitas wouldn't be enough. And that's why I made that. I knew that you would be wanting this. And I still haven't forgotten that. I mean, how did she know? I didn't tell her. I didn't call her. I didn't have a cell phone in those days to call and say, make this for me. But somehow she knew it or sensed it. And there it was waiting for me. That's one of my very cherished memories. Tied again.
can you make it yourself?
So many.
You have the recipe for that? Your favorite dish, do you have the recipe for that? Did you?
It's a very simple recipe, yes. It's not in my book. It's not in my book. Because, I never really could make it the way she did. So
that's another thing. We can never make
it. It's just something special that only she could make for me. It's one of those things in my life, in my eating memory.
It's called mother's love. Mother's
yes,
love.
Yes. I mean, I think I've been spoiled with mother's love, the amount of food that I've had. But this was a particular day in my life when, I sort of needed extra sustenance, as it were. And somehow she sensed it and she made it. And how can I ever forget that? How can I ever forget that?
Wonderful.
Along with many, many memories, this is one of my most cherished memories. And a very ordinary cold winter day to have this waiting for me.
Especially now, yeah. Anahita, do you want to recall something which favorite food memory?
I mean, I think I don't know what it is, but it definitely has to be a connection between a mother and daughter, and she just spoke about her memory, which just made me smile, and I felt like I was there in the moment, when she felt, how mothers just always know, and even if you tell them that if you think better, which all daughters think that they know better, they always correct it very quickly. And my mother's been a home cook, and she's been actually, I mean, I would say home chef for the last 25 years, because she's been catering from home. And we grew up very, very, with a very diverse palate at home, because she would experiment a lot. So there would be Parsi food, and there would also be, a random souffle, a random carrot cake. She might try some homemade pasta. She was one of the first people to start making mayonnaise and selling it in a supermarket in Delhi 30 years ago. So, she was extremely entrepreneurial. She's always made spices and, condiments and cakes from home. So we grew up in a kitchen which was always busy, and there was lots of activity happening in it. And I think one of my favorite memories would be coming back from school, and when we would be at the gate of the house, I would know what's cooked for lunch. And now I don't know how this would happen. This would be literally a game every single day. I'd come back, and as soon as I entered the gate, I'd be like, okay, you know what? This is what's made for lunch. And we would get to the lunch table, and that's what would be there. And there would always be an element of surprise from her end for us kids, because there would be some kind of cake on the table, and in our tiffin boxes, when we would open the tiffin box in school, there would be a slice of cake every single day, and different. So it could be carrot, it could be chocolate, it could be orange, it could be lemon. She makes the most wonderful apple cakes. And I mean, those memories, every single time I look at a tiffin box, or I look at, I get that aroma of cinnamon and apple, and it just reminds me of, her cakes. So I think a lot of those memories have been around the time that we went to school, and, we were also experimenting with our own palettes, and just the kitchen being busy. That's it.
Mhm.
That's so nice. That's so the recipes both of you have given are from your families, or is it like a Parsi, like a generic Parsi recipe?
So each recipe in the book is a recipe which is from the family. So,
Family,
it could be a certain aunt who specializes in something. It could be an uncle. I have recipes which my grandfather and his brother used to make, because a lot of men in the family, in my dad's side, a lot of men used to cook. So they would make mango jams, and they would make,
Wow.
breakfast was something that they made, and they were extremely forward thinking in that way. So my grandmother would actually enjoy her chini malai toast for breakfast with her tea, with her Parsi chai, and my grandfather would probably, whip something for breakfast. Not every day, it's not ideal, but yes, it did happen when we were there on summer vacation.
So it's all essentially family recipes.
Yes, most of them are family recipes.
And what
Yes,
about
in my book
what
also, practically everything that you see in this book is a family recipe, except one. There is the one recipe that is in a chapter on Bangladesh, which is a recipe from Bangladesh, made by a family friend there. It's a duck recipe. And actually, until I went to Bangladesh, I'd never eaten duck. So that was a revelation of sorts. And I certainly hadn't eaten anything that was cooked this way. So I really liked it, and I asked him to teach me how to make it. And he was a very great cook, and he was generous with his time and didn't mind teaching me. It was hard for me to get the texture right initially, but eventually I did. When you read the recipe, you'll see it's a very simple recipe. At the same time, it took me a while, several trials before I could get it right, just the way he did it. So that recipe is not from my family. work.
Just
But
want to
everything
jump in
else,
here, if I can say that cooking duck is not easy. So there is a certain
no,
amount
it's
of
not.
technique that's going to go into that, and it totally depends on how long you're cooking it, if you're slow cooking it, or So I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
technique that goes into.
And the degree of fat in the duck, that's also
Absolutely,
another issue,
absolutely.
yeah,
So
to
even
manage.
even all the recipes in my book, obviously when you're cooking them at home, nobody really documents 1 teaspoon, and they'll just be like you itna dal do or aise sprinkle kar do, pinch, put a pinch. And for me, I had to make sure that it was absolutely exact, because people who've tried my recipes in the past have made it exactly the way I've made it, because I've simplified the process, or I might add extra chef tips and techniques. And even in the book, a lot of recipes are heavy on non-vegetarian dishes, because the community overall likes to eat a lot of meat. But in all my recipes, there's how can you substitute it with vegetarian if you want to make it vegan, because I do see a lot of people wanting to try out those flavors, but they're not okay having meat. So, I made sure that that balance was there in the recipes as well.
So that's what they say about Indian cooking, right? And you studied cordon bleu. It's everything is andaza, like we don't know how
Absolutely.
much pinch of salt, pinch of
Absolutely.
masala.
And honestly, that's the
Yeah.
worst thing for students who are living abroad. So a lot of friends of mine, when they speak to their mother, they'll tell them the same thing. They just put this, just do this tadka, just take put some, put
Some
this.
should put a
But the thing
spray.
is, yeah, how many or how much? And because we want to quantify things. So I think that
So,
it took me time to do that,
yeah.
from the family recipes to making them absolutely perfect and trying them out, to make sure that anyone who picks up the book can actually make it exactly the way that we make it.
Chitrita, what do you think?
About
Quantifying Indian food. I think that like music, this was a problem with Indian food, that it is always like a pinch of salt, a spring.
I think that has changed a lot. I think most people now don't do that, and so young people certainly
Yeah, they
have
need,
been,
yeah, yeah.
they have stopped doing that. They've figured out, even if it is by experimentation and countless failures, they've figured out how to make a recipe with exact amounts. And when they document a recipe, or they pass it on to somebody, they make sure that the proportions are given pretty exactly. So that style of
That's
cooking,
happening
that
now.
kind of instinctive andaz style of cooking that you mentioned, I think that is probably vanishing pretty fast. It belonged to a previous generation. Today's generation is different, So I mean, I don't cook that way. I don't cook with measurements. The things
Yeah,
that I have learned from my mother,
yeah.
and I have instinctively got the taste for it in my head, as it were. So I cook the way she did. I throw things around, and I like to experiment also, even within a very traditional format. I like to experiment. So that allows me to play around with ingredients without being tied down by the requirement of a recipe. But I think that more and more people nowadays are cooking much more technique, the way Anahita described. They are trying to figure out exactly how much, so that they can replicate the recipe in future without any hassles, without failure. So I guess it's the previous generation didn't do that, but maybe they developed their own internal technique. So even if they didn't do that, they were very rare failures. Day after day, they produced delicious meals for their families, without measuring things out by the spoonful or the cupful or glassful, and yet everything was pretty good.
I think it
um,
was just to jump in and say, well, just add to this, that I think the first time when you're making something, you're a bit skeptical, and you
yes.
want everything to be perfect, and you want it because you're trying it out for the first time and you're really unsure. And I think after the first time when you make it, you really don't need a single, it's just out of memory, and your movements are so robotic. You know where the masala dani is, you know where the kadhai is, you know where the oil is, and like I said, you don't need a recipe then, but for a lot of youngsters, I think the first few times you need that written recipe to kind of guide you. And once you've made it and you've mastered it, then, it goes into your own cookbook of, all the good recipes, which is what, we kind of
Yes.
put together and keep.
But I think
Yes,
good
indeed.
cooks are like maestros. I mean, I think there's some magic to good food.
Yes.
Because you can
Yes,
give a
indeed. And,
perfect
sometimes just plain
recipe.
instruction doesn't work.
Yeah,
That
it
way,
doesn't work.
I think the requirements of a recipe, the precise requirements of a recipe, are very helpful, especially when you're starting the process. I mean, I've certainly had disasters. I mean, living in the US, I'm writing to my mother, how did you make that particular cauliflower thing? And she says, oh, yes, do this and then caramelize the sugar. And I'm saying, caramelize the sugar? How? Okay. So I heat up pan, I put the sugar in, and then nothing's happening. Okay, I'll go and get something. I come back, the pan is burnt black. So that kind of disasters, do happen. And the existing recipe would not allow that to happen. So I agree that, especially when you are far away from home or from the source of your teaching, you need a documented, very exact recipe in order to produce good food.
Strangely, both of you have not married from the community, right? Though you write about your Parsi cuisine and you write about Bengali food.
Yes.
So was that difficult? Their palates are different again.
Yes.
You speak a lot about that, Anahita, about how you made the Punjabi balance.
Yes, absolutely. So, the thing was also that I'm a Parsi from Delhi. So, firstly, that's extremely rare because a lot of people who meet me, the first thing that they say is that, you're from Bombay. They assume that I'm from Bombay because of the community and the number is much higher in Bombay. But I've been born and brought up in Delhi. All my friends, everyone around me was, a lot of Punjabis around, growing up, a lot of friends. And marrying into a Punjabi household, I did find a lot of similarities between the two communities because both the communities are extremely loud. They would, they love to eat and drink. I mean, that's the highlight of their day. So it starts with food and it ends with food, very similar to all the other, communities in India. And they're just fun-loving, joyful people. I mean, Punjabis and Parsis both. And so I did see those similarities, and I do see that similarity between the two families. And the food is, however, very different. The cooking styles is very different. And the first few years, it also took me some time to kind of understand what is our home food going to be, the mix of two communities. And I wanted to make sure that we have enough representation from both. We have a great diverse cooking happening at home. And I want to say that it's been extremely exciting and lots of learning for me. And that journey has just started. So there's a lot of learning, and I want to learn a lot of regional Punjabi food from his parents and his nani and his dadi. And I'm excited about that as much as I am excited about showcasing my own Parsi roots.
But my case is somewhat different because I married somebody from Bangladesh, and so it was similar and yet dissimilar, the cuisines of the two parts of Bengal. Um, I grew up in a Hindu household and I married a Muslim. So there was that one big difference in that, Muslim cooking, what I found when I went there was much more heavily meat oriented than our cooking. And yet, Bangladesh is a land of rivers. And so, it's not that, they don't love fish. That's not the case. But somehow, invitations or special occasions always meant that there would be a huge number of meat dishes on the table. It's almost like hospitality. The notion of hospitality is expressed through very expensive and rich concoctions of meat, which was not the case for us. So that is something that I had a hard time initially getting used to. And then I embraced part of it because, again, like Anahita said, it's a learning process. You learn the food of another community And that is always very exciting. So like Kodumbai's duck, that's just one example. There were many other things that I learned, which I documented in my first book, The Life and Food in Bengal book. There are lots and lots of recipes there, which are from Bangladesh, not from West Bengal. And they are quite different in the way they deal with the ingredients and the emphasis they put on certain ingredients as opposed to the emphasis we put on certain ingredients. And meals are, the menus are structured very differently also. The way we would serve at a wedding is very different from the way they would serve food at a wedding. So it was a big learning process for me, but there was this commonality between us. We were both Bengalis. So there were many common things, especially in, cooking vegetables that we had, which we could enjoy together. My husband particularly liked my mother's vegetable preparations because, they were much more varied and delicate and different from what he had grown up with. So
I see Kinera. Does it mean anything? We can't hear you, Kinera.
we can't hear you.
Yeah. No, we can't hear you still.
You're on mute.
Yes, it means that it's time to wrap up the session.
I know, and we're all very hungry.
I know this whole thing has made, took you all mothers and daughters kind of thing. Go back to your roots, and then you really get into nostalgia about all this lovely things that you've had. In fact, the other day in a rock seminar, my friend Uma Magal talked to us about a new term called soulstalgia. It's nostalgia with when your soul is so.
Yes.
I think that's exactly what it is with food and memory.
Yes.
So shall I read out some comments that have come? There are no questions actually. It starts with Navanita laughing, saying that what's with bongs and food. And she also tells Anahita, thanks Anahita, food cannot be competitive. And Ravi Kasinathuni agrees and says that very well said, one need not jump to judgments and rankings. Uma Sridhar says there are some very interesting biryanis in Tamil Nadu and Kerala too, with their own specific flavors. Then Swati Jain says, Bajre ki khichdi is really good. Desi ghee is essential, I think. Usha Raman says that completely agree that cooking can be therapeutic. It forces one away from the screen. And it's so important in today's day, I think. Then Miko Sloper says comfort food, a normal trace, but a very complex reality. I think it's a very interesting comment. Then Navneeta again says, yes, emotion and nostalgia are completely tied to smell and taste. So food and cooking, I guess. Padmini Patel says, kudos to all mothers and grandmothers for contributing to our food memory, priceless for sure. Siddhika Fatima Virji says, mothers and their cooking really is such an important part of our food memory. Then Nanda Nandedkar says, absolutely true. Food evokes memories not just about the taste and flavor, but also about place and settings or events. Final conclusion, I think Navneeta says, I find myself smiling throughout this session. This is so relatable. Must get my hands on these two books, which is also, Gaurav Raikar also says, need to get Anahita's book for improving my, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, Sali par Edu. Is that correct?
It's Sali par Idu, which means, Idu means egg. So it's a baked egg dish on potato chips.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's really lovely.
Yeah, just gonna put a line here that the Sali paridu or any paridu is actually made with, sometimes when we have leftover chips and they get soggy. So we put chips in a pan with some spices and, masala, and we break eggs on it and we bake it, and it becomes like a really nice dish. So it's also, very sustainable because you're not wasting those chips, which go back.
Nobody had questions, but I have one question, Anahita, for you.
Sure.
How did you manage, with all those cakes every day in your lunchbox? How did you manage to turn out so delicate and slim?
Yeah, really.
Yeah, but this question is very important. You need to meet my husband. A, he was in my school. Secondly, my tiffin would be stolen every day because it's
Oh,
such a good tiffin. So the whole lunch break period, I was running behind someone who was taken my tiffin out of my bag already, and by the time I get it, the cake is missing. So that is what
okay.
happens. I will. That is the story.
Okay. What's your next book, Chitrita?
It's a book that combines, history and fiction and food. That's all I can
Oh,
say.
that's
It's
interesting.
something kind of still, taking shape in my head. I've started working on it, but it's in the very early stages right now. So,
Looking forward to that.
okay, thank
Um,
you.
I think we can end the session here because there are no more questions on this chat box. I think everybody loved listening to you. Relatable, they said. That's a key word. Thank you, Ratna, for conducting this session, and Anahita and Chitrita for your lovely, insights into what food and memory mean, and bringing us back the nostalgia for all of us. It was a lovely session. Thank you very, very much for being with us in HLF 2022. We are happy that a debutant author and a much written author both have launched their books here today. Thank you.
Lovely
Thank
meeting you.
you. Lovely to meet all of you. Yes.
Thank you. And to
Bye.
everyone watching, I hope you have a really good meal today. So
Yeah.
get into the kitchens and make something for yourself. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Uh,
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the morning session on HLF 2022. I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers for this session. But before I do that, I would like to mention that this session will be moderated by Nandini Krishnan. And so many of you who were with us earlier at HLF Online would recognize Nandini, who moderated the session with Perumal Murugan a few months ago. And Nandini Krishnan is the author of Hitched, The Modern Woman and Arranged Marriage, and also the Invisible Men Inside India's Transmasculine Networks. And she's also the translator, as I mentioned, of two books of Perumal Murugan. And she's also a playwright and award-winning writer. And she's writing a novel now. So a playwright, a novelist in the making, and a translator. Thank you very much, Nandini, for joining us this morning and moderating this session for us.
My pleasure.
Friends, our two speakers this morning are Juliet Jacques, who is a writer, filmmaker based in London. She has published 3 books, including Trans, a memoir, and a short story collection, Variations, which is under discussion this morning. And the third guest this morning is Ruth Vanita, who taught earlier at the University of Delhi and now at the University of Montana. Many of you would recognize her name as the one who launched India's first nationwide feminist magazine, Manushi. We all grew up on that magazine, and Ruth was one of the co-editors, co-founders of that. Ruth is also very well known for her pioneering work on same-sex love in India. She has co-edited several books on the subject, including one with Salim Kidwai called Same-Sex Love in India. And she's also a translator. She has recently translated Mahadevi Verma's My Family. And the book that is in discussion today is her novel, Memory of Light. And look out for her next book, which is coming out now, I think anytime now, is her second book of poems also, and a very interesting book called The Dharma of Justice in Sanskrit Epics. These 2 books, her poetry book as well as her Dharma book, are both coming out in a few months now. So thank you very much, Ruth, Juliet, and over to you, Nandini, with just the rider that I will be back on screen in about 35 minutes or so with audience questions. Thank you very much, and good morning, all of you, and over to you, Nandini.
Thank you very much, sir. Juliet and Ruth, I'm very glad to finally meet you after all the emails we've exchanged and after having almost got to know you through your writing. So yeah, I think that's the best part about reading somebody, especially when it borders on when the subject is something that is so close to your heart, so close to your politics. There is a sense that one has really got to know the writer, and I'm very eager to find out just how well I do. So let's maybe start off with, for those who don't know the books, and I mean they are absolute must-reads. Variations by Juliet Jacques looks at, I think would it be fair to say it's a sort of a historical account of the queer community, perhaps in England.
Or the trans community specifically.
Specifically the trans community, and I'll come to why I use the word queer, because I think in some ways, I mean, we are also discussing same-sex love in certain stories. So yeah, and Ruth Vanita's Memory of Light is again a story of same-sex love, but also I think I would say it takes you back to the courtesan era, which is highly romanticized. But then you look at the romance of it in a very different context. So Ruth, if you would like to tell, I think maybe I would like to invite both of you to speak a little bit about what it was that motivated you write the story. And Ruth, I think when I started reading the book, I didn't quite like I didn't read anything about the book. I just went right into it, and I didn't realize that it wasn't in our period until maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs down, when the context becomes inescapable. So what was it? I mean, it has become fairly common for writers to look at that era. I mean, I think maybe Umrao Jan Ada was. I'm sorry, that's my dog wanting to get in on the session. I apologize for that. No, I think Umrao Jan Ada was perhaps one of the early books which looked at almost, I think, for those who aren't familiar with the courtesan culture of India, maybe the Japanese geisha is something of a parallel. But since, I think, over the past 20 years, there have been many writers who have revisited this era. And what was it which drew you to the era, and what was it which made you want to look at same-sex love in the context of the courtesan, the Tawaif culture?
No, actually, in same-sex love in India, we had argued, and several books later, I have argued that modern homophobia is an import from Victorian England into India, especially post 1857. So then I was interested in knowing what a pre-colonial era looked like. It could have been several, but it just so happened that this is the era I knew the best at that time, because I'd written a book called Gender, Sex and the City, Courtesans. It wasn't about courtesans, it was gender, sex, it was Urdu literary culture in Lucknow, late 18th to early 19th century. So it's much earlier than the Umrao Jan Ada period. And in fact, most of the books you're talking about are later. They're late 19th, early 20th century. Mine is late 18th, early 19th century. So it's centuries difference. And I knew the poetry and the prose of that period. I'd read a lot of the poetry and translated a lot of it. That was an academic book, which very few people read, I think. So then, and then I wanted to write a love story. And I wanted to, I just want to imagine what would love be like in a period in which the present homophobia didn't exist. Not that it's at all a perfect period. There are lots of other kinds of difficulties. And what are the universal sort of, it would not be still a problem-free life, right? So there would be some, or it would be different. What would life be like in a different culture in which, so I was imagining that, and those two things kind of came together, because that my imagination was immersed in that world, in that poetry, in that prose. And yeah, that's what it came from, really.
Right. And Juliet, again, with your collection of short stories, variations, it's a challenging read, because you've taken, and I'm sure it was a much more challenging write than a read, because you've taken actual historical documents and weaved fiction around them, reimagining what may have actually taken place. So what was it that brought you to this project?
Well, I had a strong sense that trans and non-binary people were not represented in literature. And one reason for that was because we just weren't represented in history. And this was partly because of the relatively recent development of transgender identities in the global north and in the UK and Germany and the US, very much a sort of 20th century phenomenon, and before that, sort of cross-dressing and transgender behavior had been sort of subsumed into this general queerness. And it's interesting and good to hear Ruth mention that homophobic and anti-queer legislation was exported from Victorian Britain around the world, because the book deals with the way that a need to clamp down on cross-dressing in London in particular in the 19th century led in large part to silencing legislation, the Criminal Law Amendment Act that made gross indecency illegal and was the law that convicted Oscar Wilde. So there was a sort of sense in which kind of trans history had been subsumed into queer history. And I wanted to partly unravel those histories and reassert the place of sort of trans and proto-trans people within that history and look at how we've always existed and our importance to those narratives.
I'm sorry, I got logged out all of a sudden. Yeah, Juliet, if, I missed the last part of what you were saying.
Oh, I mean, really the crux of my point was about wanting to reassert the centrality and importance of trans people within queer narratives, but also to try and create a British trans fiction, because it's very scarce at the moment.
And I think one of the points that both you and Ruth have in common is that you've sort of traced you've kind of placed same-sex love, queer love, even trans, because there are transgender characters in Ruth's novel Memory of Light as well. So all of this in a historical context. And what I'm interested in is, being part of a community that is considered marginalized. How important is it to reclaim history, to perhaps rewrite history? Because we speak, when we look at feminists, the origins of feminism, we often look at the erasure of women. And I think queer people have been erased for much longer, either because of religious issues, political issues, be that as it may. So historically, I think maybe since Juliet is already on sort of en route to answering that question, perhaps you could speak about how important is it to reclaim that history?
Yeah, I think it's really important. If you don't have a past, then you can't understand your present and you can't shape your future. So I think it's incredibly important to assert, look, we have always been here, we have always existed, even before the labels to define us have really been defined, have really been fleshed out. And yeah, that's a very central part of the project. Sorry, it's very, very early here. So things aren't coming to me maybe quite as quickly as I would like. Maybe Ruth, if you'd like to pick up there.
Well, in all my work, not just this, but in my first book, Sappho and the Virgin Mary, which is about British literature from the Romantics and Jane Austen to Woolf through Wilde and Pater and everyone, my argument inconsistently has been that same-sex love is not at the margins; it's at the heart of the canon, both the British literary canon and the Indian literary canon, and not just by so-called LGBT people, but by everyone. That's my point. That the imagination is not LGBT, according to me. The imagination ranges. The literary creative imagination ranges. And so whether it is Byron or Shelley or Jane Austen or Wilde, I think all kinds of sexualities, loves, aspects of life are central and not marginal to the canon. So yeah, that's what I would say. That's my view of it.
No, but yeah, it's very interesting what you said, because there's also this issue of, I feel very often there's a need to mainstream queer issues, because queerness as such is, we often, like I said, I use the word marginalized, and we do speak of sexuality minorities, but then sometimes I do wonder whether, whether there's actually been, because so many people chose to stay hidden because they had to stay hidden in order to save themselves. And if the proportion of people taking risks was so, was so small, and yet they were so visible as to have been historically documented, it makes me wonder whether the community itself is a minority, or whether we have forced that label of minority. And isn't there a need to mainstream it and to see people, as people of various genders and various sexualities and various orientations is just part of a large mass where we don't speak of cis heteronormative as the majority? What is your opinion on that?
Well, as Kinsey said, all of us are moving. I think that sexuality, we are fluid and it's moving all the time, right? And how much more mainstream can you get than Shakespeare? It's not that everybody was hiding, it's that we are not looking. You read the sonnets, or you read the Merchant of Venice. How much more mainstream can it get? So And also, I don't think, what you actually, the Kama Sutra, one of my favorite lines in the Kama Sutra is, who does what, when, where, and why, who knows? What people are actually doing is very different from the identity category we want, especially in history, where a lot of people may be heterosexually married, but what they were really doing, we don't really know, right? We only have the literary record. And they were doing, I think, and they still are doing, I think most people whom we might think of as straight are doing a lot of things that we may not realize. So yeah, I don't buy the whole tiny minority, minuscule minority kind of narrative at all.
Yeah, I really, really like the way you put that, Ruth, and particularly that you bring up Shakespeare, of course. Very, very obvious queer strands in Shakespeare if you choose to look at them. And a friend of mine pointed out yesterday that Joseph Heller's Catch-22 very explicitly opens by talking about the central character, Yossarian, being in love with another man. And then this strand is not hugely, it's sort of quite incidental to the book. It's just part of the tapestry of life that really quite extraordinary novel presents. So yeah, as Ruth says, queerness is much more present in a lot of quote unquote canonical literature than I think a lot of critics would have sort of cared to notice. I mean, in the case of mainstreaming trans issues and identities, I think I've probably done that more actually with my memoir and with the writing I did for The Guardian than with Variations. I think Variations, fits much more into a canon of quote unquote experimental or sort of modern or postmodern literature, and it's aimed much more at a sort of audience that would read that kind of writing, whereas the more journalistic and autobiographical writing I've done was aimed more at a mainstream audience, because really, in order to, I really wanted to use writing as a tool for social acceptance, and for transsexual people in particular, it was important to do that in order to improve access to healthcare and other social services that we're pretty reliant upon, really. We can exist in the sort of shadows to some extent, but actually, in order to exist and to live in the bodies that we need to live in, we have to go through complicated medical procedures in a political climate that was trying to deny us access to those. So opening up that mainstream discourse was really a matter of survival, I think.
Right, it's interesting that both of you mentioned Shakespeare, because what I found interesting, I lived in the UK for a couple of years, and I found that and this is something which Ruth also pointed out during our email exchange, that while there was some level of acceptance of the LGB community, there was so much hate against transgender people, so much bias, and both legally and I think in terms of societal acceptance. And I find that very strange, because you do have, yes, there is cross-dressing in Shakespeare, which, you could argue that perhaps it was more convenient for male actors to don male clothes, and that might have been a device he used while staging it. But then there are certainly characters such as Mardian in, Antony and Cleopatra, who is, to use the terminology of that time, a court eunuch. And so there are characters who are present historically, but then I wonder that particular, the transphobia that seems very particular to the West, whereas in Eastern cultures, transgender people are a lot more accepted. And as Ruth pointed out, there is a lot of bias against same-sex love. So I think, I would like to hear perhaps first from Juliet about the transphobia, which is such a contradiction to the idea of acceptance of various other sexual orientations and gender orientations.
Yeah, well, look, first I should say that Britain is nowhere near as socially liberal as maybe people around the rest of the world have been led to believe. Over the last few years, I've done a lot of work in the former Soviet sphere. And so, for example, I went to Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan a few years ago, and people there were saying, could I come to Britain and get hormones and surgery on your NHS? And I said, almost certainly not, because Britain, in addition to being very transphobic, is also incredibly racist and absurdly xenophobic. And Britain is basically a country governed by its media. I think if you want to understand British politics, this is the main thing you need to understand. The British media, very, very influential, I think, in the Brexit vote a few years ago and in the landslide majority for Boris Johnson in 2019. Both of these things really a product of Britain's broadcast and print media, which has a huge problem with transphobia and is actually, I think, vastly more transphobic than the society as a whole, and is trying to make the society as a whole much more transphobic. Opinion polling consistently suggests actually that the British public are not as transphobic as its not just right-wing, but nominally liberal media. Basically, there's this strand of transphobia. There's two different strands. There's just the sort of conventional conservative strand that you can trace back to the Victorian period, back to the Old Testament, in fact, that just says cross-dressing is deviant and wrong. And then there's a strand that evolved in the 1960s in feminist and gay and lesbian movements that sort of says that trans identities somehow undermine lesbian identities or hold back the struggle for gay liberation, or that it's somehow an inherently socially conservative thing to do to transition or to cross-dress or to be trans. And those people kind of established themselves in the liberal media in the 1980s and 1990s and haven't gone away, and have really kind of made sure that as they become aware that they are close to retirement and that the society as a whole 10 years ago or so was becoming more open to trans perspectives, they've really made sure that their replacements are just as unpleasant about this issue as they are. So really, I think you have to understand it in terms of the media. And so Variations is in large part a book about the British media. Almost every story is either framed as a newspaper report or a publication, or involves the characters interacting with print and broadcast media, as well as sort of popular and underground culture. So yeah, Britain as a sort of media managed democracy is with just a particular opposition to trans people as people who make demands on publicly funded health services. I think that's the best way to understand what's going on here.
And Ruth, would you like to respond to that? Because you felt that one of the reasons there's so much prejudice against same-sex love in the Eastern culture, sort of like you mentioned that Iran was much more open to transgenderism, as well as was India and many cultures of the Middle East and the East. So you said that perhaps same-sex love is seen as a Western import, whereas your story and maybe historically, there have been multiple examples of same-sex love which make it clear that it wasn't a Western import.
But most people didn't know those stories. Now it may be getting better known. Whereas everyone knows the story of Shikandin, almost everyone. And also the whole idea of, say, a male soul trapped in a female body. That's an idea that's understood because of the doctrine of rebirth that most people in India understand. So the idea that I might have been something else in a previous birth and now I'm uncomfortable in this body, whether due to gender or anything else, but that there may be a misfit. That is an understood kind, and that's not very far from the narrative that a lot of transgender people tell. Hijras are visible, so most people have at least seen somebody, whereas they think they've never seen anyone who is gay. They may have seen, but they don't know, because those people can pass and do pass, whereas they have all seen somebody who would be either a hijra or someone. Everyone's heard of Shikandin, everybody knows that story, and there are many other stories as well. And then you mentioned Khwaja Saras. It's an understood thing. It's understood as something that is not a choice. Whereas gay and lesbian is understood as something you're just being perverse and deciding to do this. You could easily do something else. You know, that it's like a behavior that you are insisting on doing, and it's probably something you've learned from the rest. So that the understanding, it's changing, of course, a lot now. A lot of people now understand better. But traditionally, I think there is more of a grasp of what would now be called transgender than of, and when I say British, I mean from the 19th century onwards, mid-19th century. Before that, it might have the understanding, there were many different understandings that were, I think, somewhat different. Yeah.
Right.
Can I just quickly add there? I think it's really worth going back to Edward Said's Orientalism on this. It's of course a wonderful work of sort of cultural and textual analysis. But Said talks about the way Victorian Britain, characterized itself as being very kind of quote unquote morally upstanding, that is socially conservative, in contrast to a lot of the countries that Britain had colonized. And then, of course, that's sort of switched around the other way in the second half of the 20th century, and Britain was suddenly sort of characterizing itself as culturally innovative and socially and more sexually tolerant, and then contrasting itself to the Near East in particular as something that absolutely wasn't. And it'll be interesting to see if that switches again as Britain, as it is now, enters a phase of becoming much more socially conservative again. I think these processes are very interesting to observe. Yeah.
Right. So I think at this point I'd like to invite both of you to read sections of your work for the audience. But before that, just to give it some context, I found that in queer writing there tends to be an emphasis on sex over love. I'm not talking about your novels, but generally, and that's kind of skewed the focus on queerness as something which has more to do with sexuality and physicality than emotional involvement. And I think in variations, Judith, there was perhaps there were shades of this, especially like in the first story where, there's a certain lightness of emotional involvement, but then I find that there's very intense personal reflection. And Ruth, in Memory of Light, I find that the passion is rooted in emotion and the physical attraction draws from that emotion. And I say that maybe because cis-hetero romance is not seen as forbidden love, and there's somehow more acceptance of the physical and emotional going together and feeding into each other. But before I invite you to read the section that you spoke of, I'd like to know your thoughts on queer romance and the way it has been portrayed in literature up to now.
Yeah, I'll come in. Sorry, Ruth, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, go ahead.
You sure? Okay, well, yeah, again, I think this is largely tied to the legal issues we've been talking about and the regulation of the visibility of queer love and sex and sexuality that has forced a lot of people to be much more furtive, much more secretive about their love affairs. And I think that has maybe shaped a culture in which people do have sex a lot more with people that they're not necessarily in long-term relationships with. I think one of the things of living in a society that is so shot through with prejudice is it produces in its subjects, its queer subjects, a fear, maybe a self-loathing, internalized anxiety that makes it harder to hold down long-term relationships of the kind that cisgender and heterosexual writers, I think, have less of a problem not just living but also writing about. Ruth, yeah.
No, I can't generalize about it because there's such a wonderful vastness to the field, whether you're talking about The Well of Loneliness or Mrs. Dalloway or James Baldwin's work or Vijay Vandeta, all the, I think that I can't generalize, or Jeanette Winterson or whoever, Sarah Waters. I can't generalize. I won't be able to generalize at all. It's as with work about any love, it's there's a huge field. I won't be able to. Suniti Namjoshi, so I wouldn't be able to generalize on that.
Then maybe we'll get into the specifics of your novel itself, of Memory of Light. And in fact, there's this one particular passage that that really struck me. Like we often speak about whether writing is male, whether you can assign a gender to writing. And I don't know whether I would think of it as assigning gender, but then there's such a there's so much passion in your writing, Ruth. Like, I mean, there was, I think there was this one particular paragraph that I was really struck by, and it says, I mean, this is quite early on in the novel where the narrator is dreaming. She has a dream about Chapla, and then you say, I wake as it ebbs out of me. I recognize it. The old sensation of being slanted entirely towards her, even as I go about the day's business. I can't recall it at will, but somewhere it slumbers intact. And I was just thinking, just the sibilance of those lines, the poetry of those lines is something so absolutely beautiful about your writing, which I think it evokes certain emotions in the reader, which the characters themselves felt, and it makes us almost part of the story. And so that our viewers will have a taste of that if they haven't yet read your novel. Could you please read out a section for us?
I'm going to read from, I've changed it from what I told you. I'm going to read from page 117. Yeah. When we finally got into our boat, the house seemed to shimmer and drift. It stopped reaching up to the skies, its hidden depths below the river. The sun had not yet set, but a full moon was rising amid a few scattered clouds. She sighed and lay down, her head on my lap, then pulled my orni down so that it shielded both our faces from the sun's last flare. The boatman was facing the other way. I was bending over her when someone hailed us. I started back, and there was Rangin Saab, actual historical poet from the time, laughing and bowing. And Mir Shah, also a poet, was gazing at the sky, his head on Rangin Saab's lap as their boat drifted slowly past. He turned his head without raising it and smiled at us knowingly. They've exchanged turbans, you know, I said. They're brothers now. We should exchange ornis. Or bodices, but not transparent ones like yours, she laughed, her fingertips tender as lentil buds, traveling over my silk bodice and pressing the pearl buttons. Later that night, when we were all sitting together, Mir Insha remarked, what a lustrous evening. It inspired a new ghazal. Please, let us hear it, said my mother politely, and he launched into it right away, still smiling at me. On full moon night, a small cloud arose out in the flower garden, so translation of a real poem. I saw a wonder, a shimmering veil of lightning over the moon, a cloudy veil of fine fabric fluttering. They seemed to me two fairies close together. One drew near, cast her shadow over the other. Flowers' perfume said they've exchanged veils today. Lady Moonlight has become Lady Lightning's sister, and those are the pet names for the two of them. Pari, fairy, they call us, and for the first time I felt fairy-like, caught in the magical circle of light cast by his verse.
Oh, that was so beautiful, Ruth. And I think it brings together, you know, the whole marriage of a romance, teasing, and just acceptance, just the fact that these two couples chance upon each other, and then it gives rise to art, you know, in another context. I find that so beautiful. Julia, to get back to the point you were making about, I mean, you know, about the fact that certain relationships could not sustain, perhaps because they didn't have the space to. There was, I think, the first story which alludes to trans masculinity. You know, the paper presentation in variations. There is a real, I mean, there is a section where this woman, I mean, I think she identifies as male, but also sees herself as involved in same-sex love, simply perhaps because they didn't have the vocabulary for certain things back then. And the person speaks about how a lot of these relationships died out, perhaps from fear of being found out, perhaps because at that time women didn't have houses of their own, right? Which again goes back to a room of one's own, and you know. I think I'd like to speak to you about that, about the historical denials and deprivations which have largely, I think, scarred the queer community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that story you speak of is called Reconfiguration. It's set in the 1920s, and it's dealing, I think, the most explicitly of all the stories with that process of defining identities around gender identity and sexuality, and separating those two things, understanding them as distinct phenomena. And the central character is the British sexologist Havelock Ellis, who was quite prominent at the time. It's not really spoken about a lot now outside of academic circles. And it's also the context. I mean, you mentioned Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. And it does also touch on the way that after the First World War, there was more of an emergence of this independent women's sphere that followed the activism of the suffragettes and the granting of the vote to women, but also the mass involvement of women in the workplace as a result of the conflict. And so this brought women and, you know, as a result, queer women and transmasculine people slightly more into public view. And Ruth mentioned earlier Radcliffe Hall's novel The Well of Loneliness, which is explicitly referenced in my story. So the story is dealing, as are all of the stories in their own way, dealing with the establishment and evolution of those identities. And this story is the first one in the collection to really deal in depth with transmasculine identities. I mean, maybe I could choose a short passage of that to read. A lot of that story is case studies. It's a case study that Havelock Ellis is looking at with this trans, or a proto-trans man. So I'll read from page 55 to 56, which is the character who's just known as R in Ellis's case notes, talking about their sexuality and their gender, and talking about relationships. So I'll start with the beginning of that quote. So R says, "At the same time, I began to think less about Marianne, a previous lover, and more about how I could change this situation, and yet how disappointed my parents would feel once they knew that I could not give them grandchildren, or I would not give them grandchildren. I met another woman, Claire, who'd recently moved from London to Cardiff to work for the Independent Labour Party. She told me about balls in London where women could meet and dance together, how her friends would sometimes go to Paris or Berlin, where it was easier to be honest about who they loved. And she showed me some magazines that she kept hidden in her little apartment in Park Place. Claire made me forget about Marianne. She was beautiful in the same feminine way, but more open with her emotions, helping me to express myself too. When Gwyn, R's male partner, was away, she took me to London and we danced together. I borrowed a suit from Richard, a male invert that she knew. I felt and looked resplendent in traditional black tie, and that one night of waltzing with Claire in her beautiful ball gown, me taking the lead, and then staying at Richard's house and strapping something to my waist so I could make love to her. For both of us, it was heaven. For me, because I'd never had the chance to be the man with a woman before, and for her, because she'd never found anyone who wanted to do that with her. We kept meeting whenever we could, asking each other if there was any way we could make a life together, maybe in the Welsh countryside. Soon, the only time I would think about Gwyn was when Claire and I talked of how I'd tell him and my family about what I really wanted to do, wondering how much easier it would be if I were Gwyn, and if a lady like Claire were taken with me. And that was when Gwyn proposed to me. From the way our conversation went, I immediately realised that I'd been wrong to think that Gwyn was an invert too. I hesitated, and the look in his eyes betrayed him. I saw this desperation, a loneliness because he'd never met a woman who listened to him, who understood him, and over the time we'd spent together, I'd come to see him as a very dear friend. I'd become his confidant, and maybe that was more important to him than anything else, but for me that didn't mean love. As his face broke into a half smile, I just said, I can't. I tried to embrace him, hoping he would realise that it wasn't him, but he ran out of the room weeping. Immediately, my thoughts turned to my parents and how I would explain.
Thank you so much, Juliet. I think the same story got me thinking about the fact that, in fact, there is a paragraph, where we speak about how art is drawing attention to the fact that it's this kind of an erasure of borders between trans masculinity and being lesbian. So the confusion of sort of cis people who are attracted to their own gender and trans people who are attracted to the opposite sex is something that's often criticized today. But maybe a couple of centuries ago, as I said earlier, when perhaps the vocabulary and the knowledge and the scientific progress was much less than it is now, do you think that line was blurrier?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's partly because of these discourses start with the law, really, and the law just criminalize the police arresting and then the parliament passing laws that just criminalized same-sex love and cross-dressing and trans behavior. All of these things were criminalized together, and really the attempt to understand gender identity and sexuality as separate phenomena comes out of that criminalization. It's a response to that criminalization in the late 19th and early 20th century. So yeah, I think it was because those identities were shaped by the legal infrastructure that people lived in.
Yeah, but what's also interesting is that sexologists such as Magnus Hirschfeld, who I think conducted some of the very early trans reassignment surgeries, and Havelock Ellis did acknowledge that there was a distinct difference, and you made a reference to that. I think, I mean, maybe you could read out that passage. It begins with, I think R was. Let me see if I've got it.
Nandini, I think we are running out of time.
Okay, so then let me wrap up with a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. I think this is something which hopefully Juliet's readers will find for themselves. But yeah, so Ruth, I wanted to ask you about the fact that you did allude to the Bechdel test in your email, which she does acknowledge she got from Virginia Woolf, and we've been making references to Woolf. So this idea of women speaking to each other in the absence of men about something other than men. Would you like to elaborate on the importance of that to you and to the novel?
Well, Woolf said that in most literature that happens very rarely. Women speaking to each other about something other than men happens very rarely. And she said if Chloe likes Olivia and Mary, whoever knows how to write about it, then we'll have a different type of literature. That's what I was referring to. Anyway, Vijay asked me to show the cover. So here's the book. And well, it just occurred, not while I was writing the book, much later, it occurred to me that, well, in this book, women are constantly speaking to each other about all kinds of other things, about shopping, about art, about love, about life, about friendship, about fights, about games, about a range of things. And this is not just in the book, but in the poetry I drew on. Women are talking to each other all the time about all kinds of things. So yeah, and there are male characters as well, and women talk to men as well, but a lot of the conversation is between women. So yeah.
And I think I'd like to ask you one last question, Ruth, because we've been speaking largely about your novel in the context of same-sex love, but then there are transgender characters, and you in fact mentioned characters who would be known as transgender today, which was not the term used back then. One of the most striking sentences in your book early on is there's a reference to the emperor's mother having an affair with the Khwaja Sarai. And which was like a bit of a shock for me, because the Khwaja Sarai were trusted to take care of the women simply because, as Marian says in Antony and Cleopatra, not indeed, for I can do nothing. But then there is this affair which she has with the Khwaja Sarai. So maybe I'd like you to speak a little bit before we open up for questions about the transgender characters in your novel and maybe your research on transgenderism at the time.
I researched one of them a lot, Almas Ali Khan. I also have a poem on him in my next collection. And the thing is, we use this term, and our terms change from time to time. I don't think we necessarily have the best terms, or we know much more than people 500 years ago. I don't agree with that kind of view that every day and everywhere things are getting better and better. Transgender is there was a range of things going on, and they weren't all quite the same. Now, Khwaja Sarai, for example, where many of them were boys who were captured in war, and were forcibly castrated and then made to guard the women and so on for reasons that you said. And then many of them also became very prosperous and they rose to become important statesmen and so on. But they'd also lost something that they hadn't consensually wanted to lose, And but they lived as men. They definitely didn't want to be addressed as anything other than men. So that's very different from Hijras, who mostly take female names and live as women. It's entirely different. They lived as men and they insisted that they were men. They had male names and everything. When you said did they have affairs? See, the reason you have a Khwaja Sarah guarding the women is so that he can't make them pregnant. That is the point. Now, what women get up to on their own in the women's quarters is another matter. The Kama Sutra also refers to it, right? Who cares about that? Women are playing with each other as long as they're not getting pregnant. So same with the Khwaja Sarah. There's sex that is not the penetrative sex that is going to make you pregnant. There's other kinds of sexual engagement, and that can happen. Why couldn't that happen? It's not something that will be talked about a lot, but it is mentioned, and it did happen. Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, I think we should take up.
Incredibly short, but I think we should open up to questions because I'm sure there's a lot of them coming.
Yeah, there are some very interesting observations, questions. I'll begin with Heta Pandit. Heta is asking, probably this is for Nandini as well as Ruth, has anyone here seen this recent film called Chandigarh Ki Ashiki? But the more interesting is that Heta also asks, how does the Ardhanarishwara fit into this concept of gender? Ruth may probably take that question.
I have seen the film. I liked it, and I know it's went for a lot of criticism. I really liked Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan. That's the film I've been waiting for all my life. But Chandigarh Ki Ashiki was also good, I thought. And you're not going to get the perfect film. It's the first film, and it's making I think a good attempt. It actually explains a lot of things. It even shows physical, the body, etc. I liked it. So. That's that. And Ardhanarishwara can be interpreted in so many different ways. It can be interpreted as Shiva and Parvati together, the husband and wife who are one as well as two. It can be interpreted as the bisexuality of everyone. It can be interpreted as there's masculine, which Virginia also says, there's masculine and feminine in us all the time, and it's all the time changing, the fluidity of sexuality. It can be interpreted as so many things. The real change is when Vishnu becomes Mohini, that kind of change that happens in a lot of Hindu texts, and then he goes back to being Vishnu. That you can magically change your sex, then you can go back and you get the choice. Do you want to go back and be a man, or do you want to be a woman? And then some people say, yes, I want to be a man. Some say, no, I want to stay being a woman. If you could change like that, then which of us wouldn't do it all the time? So I think. So Bhangasvana is another such character in the Mahabharata who from a man becomes a woman and is asked, do you want to go back to being a man? And says, no, I prefer to be a woman. Women it's better being a woman. So yeah.
Ravindranath Kashinatuni has several observations and questions, but one I will take is again, Ruth, when you said that in India, the trans, just a minute, let me get that. Yeah, regarding relative higher acceptance of trans community in India, I'm not so sure because we still cross to the other side of the road when we spot someone, from that community, and we are still uncomfortable, about sharing an auto rickshaw or something like that. So, so how does that fit with what you said?
Obviously, when I say relatively, it doesn't mean that it's complete acceptance of entire acceptance by everyone of it. No, absolutely not. The very meaning of the word relative is somewhat more. And I was thinking particularly of court cases of the Supreme Court gave a judgment that said that transgender are a minority and the government must do affirmative action for them, must give them minority rights as a minority. And that judgment came first before the judgment abolishing Section 377, and the government still has not said we define LGBT as a minority and you must do affirmative action for them. So I just meant relative. It doesn't mean that it's perfect by any means. That's not all I meant.
One of the questions, I don't know why it was retracted, but was a question about Roshnara. So Ruth, a quick answer to that, because I that question has been withdrawn. I don't know why.
Roshanara, what about her?
I mean, it's the question, if I remember right, said she had sex with a transgender every night and killed the by the morning or something like that.
Is there any source for that? Or is
I
that just
don't
a-
know. I mean, yeah, but one last question I think we'll take is to both of you. Probably you can give a quick answer. Is that if mainstreaming of the whether it is trans or whether it is LGBTQ, is there any kind of a data about, not necessarily data, but do we have a sense of who is reading these books, and if it is the same community or people who identify themselves as this, if that is the only readership, how do we expect any kind of a change or acceptance or better understanding of this?
I'm absolutely sure that's not the only readership. My book was published by Penguin, and not just my book, any number of books on these novels as well as nonfiction has been published by Penguin, by Random House of HarperCollins, by Rupa Books, by all the mainstream publishers. They wouldn't publish it if it was just one group. They are appealing to that group, of course, but also across the board. I mean, I've been asked to give talks at so many, even the HLM, it's not just for. So yeah, and not just me, like so many writers before this. Suniti Namjoshi is being read across the board, and
Yes.
she was writing much before I was, right?
Yeah. What's it like, Juliet?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to gauge who is reading. And indeed, when I wrote the Guardian series in particular, the whole point of that approach was to reach readers who wouldn't normally read about trans lives and trans issues. The pieces I wrote would go on the front page of their website, and bored people at work would click on them and read them. And again, social media platforms, particularly Twitter, really do allow you to reach a much larger audience potentially, and a much more diverse audience than maybe your books are marketed towards. I mean, I think partly because I published with Verso, which is an explicitly socialist publisher, a lot of my readership, I think, in Britain is people broadly on the political left. Maybe that's less true for Variations, which, as I said earlier, is aimed at a more literary audience. But I think in all of those contexts, my audience cuts across trans people, LGBT people, and cisgender and heterosexual people. And I'm not really trying to write for any one of those communities. The whole point is to try and speak to lots of them simultaneously and break down supposed cultural barriers between those readers and those audiences.
Yeah, one quick comment from each of you. One phrase that has come again was, this is a question by Shivapriya, who is asking, we often hear about this term modern homophobia. So is this, I mean, could you elaborate? Is it really modern, and how modern is modern? And,
Can I come in first?
Yes,
there?
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to Ruth's point at the beginning of the session about this quote unquote modern homophobia being a colonial imposition, exploitation. I mean, homophobia has always existed, but it wasn't really, I mean, it was in Britain, the first law against any sort of sexual behavior was a law against sodomy passed in 1553, and indeed, you go back to the Old Testament, you can find dictates against homosexuality and cross-dressing in the early chapters of the Old Testament. So it's always there, but I think the legal framework and the media framework for homophobia, for transphobia, was really developed certainly in Britain in the Victorian period, in the 19th century, and that I think is a different type of homophobia to what existed before. But I think it's been there as long as homosexuality and sexual diversity and gender variance have been there, I think.
Ruth, you will have the last word.
In India, I think it's definitely modern. This kind of modern, the kind of modern homophobia where you can be clearly with 377 is the first law we know of, we actually be punished or put in prison for it, right? So clearly, and just the testimony of literature. I mean, in literature, in so many languages, has a whole range of writing about a range of different sexualities and genders, and that changes in the late 19th century and becomes unspeakable only in the early 20th century. It never was unspeakable in India before that, but it was unspeakable in Europe for a long time, at least from the medieval period onward. So yeah, this is not we don't have the time for the whole history lesson here, but
Yeah, I know.
yeah, it definitely is modern.
Yeah.
And yet, despite that, I do want to say in response to your earlier question that I think
2022. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we close this session. Sorry, Nandini?
Maybe we could have like them show the books once so people will know what cover to look out for when they go to the
Yes. Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Juliet. And thank you for the conversation, Nandini.
Thank
and
you.
Friends, with this, we close this session, and we'll see you exactly in 4 minutes, after the break. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Really. Welcome to the session on women in cinema. We have 3 women writing on cinema here. The first one is the beautiful actor and talented actor, Divya Dutta. The second is an author-publisher, Ritu Menon. And the person talking to them is scriptwriter-author Advaita Kala. I will begin by introducing the session moderator, Advaita Kala. Advaita Kala is the best-selling and internationally published novelist, and that's only one part. She is also a contributing editor to India Ahead, screenwriter, and a magnificent queen of understanding hotel businesses across South Asia. Her debut novel, Almost Single, has sold over 150,000 copies in India alone and has been translated into multiple languages, including French, Marathi, and Hindi. Advaita is an award-winning screenwriter, most notably of the film Kahani, which I love, the Vidya Balan starrer with nail-biting suspense. Unique to Advaita's writing is her ability to cross genres. She has written a TV show for primetime television, film, fiction, numerous columns in leading publications on a range of issues from politics to social concerns and women's rights. Her film and literary work has focused on themes of female empowerment and experience. Divya Dutta is the well-known Indian actress who has worked in over 80 feature films. She was born and raised in Ludhiana, Punjab. She has established a successful career in Bollywood, in Bollywood and Punjabi cinema, and has also appeared in other Indian language as well as international productions. She is noted for playing a wide variety of roles in different genres, and she is one of the leading actresses of parallel cinema. She has won recognition and several awards in the film industry, including the IIFA and Zee Cine Best Supporting Actress Awards. The Stars in My Sky is her second book published this year, 2021. Ritu Menon is a publisher and author of, among others, the groundbreaking Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Partition in 1998, the critically acclaimed Out of Line, a literary and political biography of Nayanthara Sehgal in 2014, and the quirky Loitering with Intent Diary of a Happy Traveler 2016. Zohra, a biography in 4 acts 2021 is her latest publication. And I simply adore Zohra and I'm looking forward to this. Now a brief overview of the books under discussion in the session today. The Stars in My Sky, as mentioned, is her second book, and Divya Dutta recounts her experiences with some of the stalwarts of Bollywood who played a significant role in her film journey. She talks about the inspirations they have proved to be in her life through what they did for her and what she learned from them. From winning an acting scholarship with Sonali Bendre to sharing a vanity van with Juhi Chawla and her bond with Shabana Azmi, she tells it all with rare candor and humility. Her interactions with stars like Irfan Khan, Amitabh Bachchan, Rakesh Mehra, and many more show not only the deep impact they had on her life, but also how that defined the trajectory of her own career. Divya, may I request you to please hold up your book for our viewers to see?
Very good afternoon, everyone. And here is my book, my second one, The Stars in My Sky.
Ritu Menon's Zohra, biography in 4 acts. This is the first comprehensive account of Zohra Sehgal's life and work that situates her as a path-breaking figure in the history of Indian dance, theatre, TV, and cinema. It is based on interviews with directors like Gurinder Chadha, Ken McMullen, and Waris Hussain, and filled with absorbing details about theatre, films, and television in Bombay and London. Sehgal was an unusual celebrity who acted with international stars like Richard Gere, Rita Tashingham, Michael York, and Madhur and Saeed Jaffrey, and with Amitabh Bachchan, Aishwarya Rai, Tabu, and Govinda in India. The book contains fascinating anecdotes about legends like Uday Shankar and Prithviraj Kapoor, and insights into the struggles and successes of South Asian artists in Britain. An essential book for fans of Sehgal, it is a valuable resource for anyone interested in the history of performing arts in modern India. Ritu, may I request you to please hold up your book for our viewers?
Sure, thank you. Here we go. Hi, everyone.
Thank you very much. Advaita, I'll come back about 7 to 8 minutes before the closure with any questions that our audience may have.
Sure.
The session is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really delighted to be spending this Sunday afternoon with two remarkable women and authors who are going to talk to us through their journey of writing and what's brought them to this point, and really their subjects. So let's dive right into it. I don't like to take up too much time as a moderator when we have such interesting guests, so I'm just going to dive right into it. And let's start with you, Miss Menon.
Why? Ritu, please.
Okay, Ritu, why did you pick Zohra Sehgal as a subject?
When Zohra was 101 years old, she rang me up and she said, Mubarak de do, 100 plus 1. So she died when she was 102. So I thought to myself, here is a woman, 100 years old, who has spanned the 20th century of the arts in India, and cinema and television, and a remarkable century. And she's been in all the performing arts. Actually, she's the only woman in all the performing arts in the country, except for music, dance, theater, film, television, and in a century that saw amazing shifts in all the arts. And she was there, and she was present, and she was active, and she was very much an embodiment of what was happening. So I thought, here's a woman who defied the norm, broke the mold, took up the challenge, came from an aristocratic family, decided to go into what was then not a terribly respectable art for women. First of all, dance, and then film. And not only does she do that, but she defies all the conventions to persevere, to continue doing what she wanted to do, whether it was in India or in England when she went there. So I thought, she's a Muslim. She marries a Hindu who's 12 years younger than her. I mean, how many women would do that even today? And yet, there she was in 1930, going on an overland trip from India to Europe, deciding to jump ship and go and learn dance in Germany. She didn't know the language, she didn't know the country, she had no contacts, she knew nobody there. She was 19 years old. I don't know if I would do that. But she did in 1930. I thought, here's a life that should be worth exploring and writing about. And I can say that it was a most fascinating journey with her and with the arts, actually. With looking at Uday Shankar and the Almora Dance Academy, with looking at Prithvi Raj Theatre and Prithvi Theatres. And then, of course, the 20 years she spent in England, which is where, she was with all the names that were mentioned earlier, performing with all the greats, much before the Priyanka Chopras and the, and all the others who we think have made it big. So
the crossover
just seemed like, here's a life worth exploring, worth writing about, worth presenting, really. So that was it.
Divya, have you ever met Zohra Sehgal? We can't seem to
hear you.
I think she's having a little internet trouble. Okay, maybe she should log back in And, Ritu, I have an interesting anecdote about Zora Sehgal. I used to work in hotels. That was then my introduction. And there was a play that she was doing with her sister from across the border in Pakistan,
Yes,
if you recall.
Right.
And this was in the early 2000s and well into her 80s, both of them. And we had been, how you get a guest profile before people come and, likes, preferences, all of that. And before her sister her checked into our hotel, we were told that they don't really get along.
Oh.
So, and it was really funny. I mean, they may have been even 90 plus or something, and both actresses.
Yeah.
And both divas. And I remember at the time of checkout, they came to the reception and one came before the other. I can't recall which one, but there was a small bill on her account, which was her sister's. And she said, please transfer that to her. That's not mine.
Yes.
So it was transferred. And then they literally sat because, the older guests, they were sitting, they split their bills up to the last rupee. It was a long checkout.
She always used to say, and I don't know, maybe since you recounted this story, she always said, I'm a Pathan, but I'm also a Jew. So, मैं गिनती हूँ, मैं पैसे गिनती हूँ. Now, the thing is, I don't know about, the story about the two of them not getting on, because actually she adored Uzra. And one of the real sorrows of her life was when Uzra and her husband decided to move to Pakistan in the early 50s. I mean, they were both in Bombay, as you know, the entire family, meaning Uzra and her husband, Zora and Kameshwar, and, in Bombay performing together. And when Uzra and her husband decided to leave for Bombay, it was for Zora a very emotional break, because her brothers had left, two of her other sisters had left, and the only people remaining in India were her father, her elder sister, Hajra, Uzra and herself. And when Uzra decided to go, she felt really bereft. And actually, one of the reasons that she performed so often in Pakistan was because she could perform with Uzra.
Oh, lovely.
So I think, there's a lot of, she always said, she was the beauty and I was the beast. And, she had lots of little one-liners like this, none of which actually you learned to take seriously, except the bit about the money.
Okay. I think maybe they were on this long tour and must have had some tensions or some creative differences. So, we always in the hotel, you always get a warning about the mood your guest is in. So if Divya was checking into the hotel and I was working there, they would tell us, oh, she's been a real kind of difficult person this last week. So just hands off. When she comes in, no selfies, no nothing. Just let her go to her room and let her stay there. But Divya, I was asking you earlier, had you had a chance to meet Zora Sehgal?
I can't hear her. Oh no.
She can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm back. God. Okay, so I'm saying I have had the opportunity of shooting Veer Zara, and she was there with us.
Wonderful.
And I have to tell you this anecdote. I mean, it's just flowing back beautifully. We were shooting, and she was supposed to be lying ill on the bed. Okay, and the doctor's coming to visit her. She played a prank on us. She acted dead. And then there was such a crazy chaos on the set. And then she just opens one eye and such a twinkle in her eyes, that naughty brat had, whatever age she was, I adored her. We have cycled together. We have had sugarcanes together. I mean, kulfis. I don't think there was ever anybody like Zora Sehgal. And I'm genuinely looking forward to reading this one, Ritu.
She's very funny. When she was 100, there was a party for her at the Habitat Center.
Okay.
And so she was given 100 roses. And of course, she arrived on a wheelchair, which is how she was, how she was mobile later, much later. And of course, she was the She was the belle of the ball as usual. But after the whole thing was over, she went to her room. They had taken a room for her just in case she felt tired. So she went up to her room, and I went up a little later just to see if she was okay. And there she was, tucked up in bed, sitting up. So I just went up to her and I said, Zorapa, can I get you some tea or something? She said, tea? Where's my whiskey? So pranks, I think, were her forte. I can't imagine her not playing a prank.
I can still imagine her twinkling face and naughty smile. I think that was Dohra Sehgal, all warmth, all so full of life, live wire, I would say.
Yeah, absolute live wire.
Yeah.
So Divya, this is your second book.
Yes.
And what does it feel like the second time around?
It feels nice that you've been wanted back. It was a new field for me when I came first with me and Ma, and I was introduced to this beautiful literary world where I met authors, I met writers, I attended their sessions, and then to my surprise, I had my own session amongst them. And what a warm welcome I got there. I think I began at the Kushban Singlet Fest. It was my first one I had gone to with that book. And then after the book got all the love and everything, and what a connect it had with the readers, everyone started asking me, when is your next book? What is it about? So there was no question that, are you going to write another book? No. It was like, what is your next book all about? So I was like, okay, what is it that I'm most passionate about? And the only one word that came to me was the world of movies that I belong to. And what brings me a smile always is like people such as Zora ji, who just came into my life. There have been people who have either patted my back or just said that word that I really needed to hear, or just been there at the right time just to bring me a smile. I think when it's your own journey, these little things really matter a lot. And there are very few opportunities you get to tell that person that you're extremely grateful and thankful and that you love them very much. So I think this book is about those few people who I think I really adore from the core of my heart, and I wanted to tell them that. And this is about my experiences with them. It's so amazing that as a child, I always wanted to be an actor, and looking up to people like Mr. Bachchan, Shabana ji, Sham Benegal, they were my most favorite people. And I grew up to become an actor, working with them. And then I have an amazing bond with them. I think it's very cherished, and I think this needed to be penned down. So this book is about that.
And it's so timely, Divya, because I actually felt that it was an exercise in gratitude, wasn't it? In many ways, you belong to a very tough, judgmental, harsh business. And to have encountered these people and to have seen the light through them so many times must have really pushed you along this journey, which has now been about, even for you, 2 decades long now.
Yes. I don't think it's a harsh world, Advaita. I think everyone has their own journey, darling. Everyone has their own issues and problems. And if I sometimes feel, why did that so-and-so didn't cast me for his film 20 years prior? I'm sure they had their reasons now when I look back. And I think I've worked with all of them now. So I don't hold any grudges or anything, but I just feel these people that I'm extremely fond of, we chat, we work together, we do masti. But how many times do you say, hey, listen, I really love you very much. So I think this is that book. This is like, I wouldn't say like a gratitude thing. I would just say these people made my journey way far more beautiful than I thought it would be. And I feel very lucky to have them in my life.
Right. And Ritu, you've described your book as a feminist biography. And you said that you were trying something new with that. So tell us a little bit about this genre, so to speak, and also how you went about it.
I wish it were a genre, but I'm not sure that it is yet. Anyway, okay, why did I call it that? It's one thing to write a life or to try and write a life. And it's always almost impossible to do that. I mean, I think that we must understand or accept right at the start that you can only tell part of a life, or you can tell something about that life, but you can't really encompass everything. So then it becomes a matter of choice. What is it that you choose to tell? What is it about that life that makes it worth telling? And how do you select what you want to say? So I think the feminist part came in there. For me, it's very important if I'm writing about a woman's life, what were the decisive choices that she made as a woman? And how did they influence the way she lived her life? What was that moment in her life, or those moments in her life, that enabled her to live the way she lived? So it's in Zora's case, as it was in Nayanthara's case, the critical choices that they both made were a result, in Nayanthara's case, of her marriage, and in Zora's case, of her deciding not to get married. Now, we know this at an intuitive level, but we also know it in real life, that marriage is a watershed for all women. It's a watershed moment in their lives. The choice not to marry in Zora's case, imagine, she comes from an aristocratic, very conventional family where marriage is almost taken for granted, meaning it's already scripted. And indeed, she was betrothed to a cousin. Indeed, that was what was expected of her. And she decides, no, that's not what I'm going to do. Then she makes another unconventional choice, which is to become a dancer, of all things. Then she continues with that choice, and she goes on and she joins an absolutely unconventional bohemian like Uday Shankar, well known for his being a bohemian, and joins his academy. Then she marries a man 12 years younger. When she finally decides to marry, she marries outside her community and a man 12 years. Now, all of these had a very important impact on her life and on how she chose to live it. So I decided, okay, these are the things that I would like to highlight. Not the normal film, theater, dance stuff, no. But who were the men in her life who were really significant? Not who were her lovers and her boyfriends and her, the gossip sort of links that were made, but who were the men in her life, in her career, who were really significant? So I separated the personal in that sense from her professional. This is a feminist enterprise. This is not something that you would do. If I were writing about a male writer, I would focus much more on the political or the public or the professional than on the personal. As a feminist biographer, I do both. I don't see the personal as distinct from the professional, but I do see the professional as being very closely an outcome of personal decisions and choices.
Ritu, quick question. As a feminist biographer and as a feminist, is there the risk of a blind spot if you are evaluating a subject based on these feminist principles?
There's always a blind spot, Advaita, whether it's a feminist or not. I mean, whichever way you look at it, there are things that you highlight and things that you choose to emphasize and others that you don't. I don't see it as being a particular issue as a feminist. I do say that there is no such thing as neutral. So of course I have a bias.
Yes.
And I'm very open about that bias. I mean, it's something that I choose to exercise. It's a choice. I don't ever say that I'm neutral in my choice. So, of course, I could choose to write about a male writer or a male actor. I don't. And so the perspective that you use will always have a bias, one way or another.
Right.
I don't see that you can write about, let's say, a cricketer without a bias. Um, a politician without a bias.
Sure. Yeah.
Anybody. I mean, whatever your subject is. So yes, of course, if I am feminist and that's my perspective, it will have a particular, you could call it a blind spot, but I choose to call it a bias.
Divya, it's a nice segue into your world. This sisterhood that, we so often speak of, you seem to have experienced that in some measure in your own experiences. You speak very affectionately of Shabana Azmi. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because so often on the outside, we hear these stories, and then yet there can be these nurturing relationships as professionals, as women, that help you excel as well.
I do feel, Advaita, that these kind of bonds that we have, the female bonds that we have, are just not in the industry, they're outside as well. I mean, there's no better bond than have a best friend who would probably listen to you, share things with you. Sometimes you just need just that. When I entered the industry, first of all, I met Sonali Bendre, who was my batchmate. And so I looked at this girl who was like tall, beautiful, stunning, and I was this petite girl just from Punjab, a simple looking woman. And I was like, am I seeing like a dream? Can she ever be my friend? So it was like that kind of an unachievable thing. So, but she was so warm and affectionate. I remember during a course, I fell off the horse while the training. And she actually literally mothered me, like right from helping me eat, feed me, so much so that I had to lose a lot of classes. She actually pushed me to learn that dance, just prepare that dance performance, and I actually did it very well. So that bond to date remains beautifully. I remember after the training that we finished, I used to go to her house because I used to be very homesick. So meeting her parents, and she used to say, "Kar lenge yaar." We have a very interesting anecdote, in fact, where she and I were actually naughty brats. So we had a shoot going on just in the right adjacent bungalow, the film called Andaz Apna Apna, where Amir and Salman were shooting. So they were shooting there, and I climbed up the wall and I just excitedly called Sonali. I said, Sonali, shooting is happening. Come watch. So she said, who's it? I said, Salman and Amir. So she said, kya dekhna hai yaar, hum kaam karenge inke saath. And saying so, that confidence that we had, we actually, both of us worked with these people. So I think dreaming together, working with similar interests, seeing each other's low points together, just gives you that bond and that strength to move forward. And you don't even realize it. You look back and realize, oh, at that point, this person was so integral in my life. And same with Shabana ji. I think with Shabana ji, the thing was different because I have always looked up to her. In school or college, anybody asked me who's your favorite actor, it was Shabana Azmi. And the first film I worked with her was Umrao Jan. And I was totally intimidated. And she called me and she said, so you're performing a dance right now? And I was so nervous. I ran up to the choreographer and I said, listen, you make sure I don't go wrong at all. So make me rehearse as many times as you can. Somewhere, I think that naughty glint that we are talking about, Zohra ji, I also see that naughty glint in Shabana ji's eyes. And she actually pulled me up a lot in a very, very affectionate, endearing way. And somewhere going to her house for her holy parties, for everything, and especially after my mother gone, somewhere this bond has turned into something else that I can't explain. So much so that even for this book, where the foreword is by Mr. Bachchan. Two favorites I've had. So in the previous
I was going to come to him.
Yes. So I just told her, Shabana ji, wherever you, I mean, I didn't even ask her if you're free or not free. I said, wherever you are, you have to come and launch this book for me. So I just thought, इतना हक कहाँ से आया? तो ये हक शायद बना इतने सालों में, इतनी खूबसूरती से बना, और इन्हें मैं बहुत cherish करती हूँ. I really cherish these bonds with all the women friends that I have worked with, inconsequential of who they are and what they are.
Yes, there's a lovely post on your Instagram. I think it's a photograph that's been taken in Shabana Azmi's house, where there's you and there's Shohana Goswami, who I think also is a very good actor. All of you kind of 5, 6 of you sitting together, and it's a wonderful picture because you're all actors and you're in the field and you're probably competing for your roles at some point. And there's this bonhomie and this fun element in that photograph.
Yeah.
And you shared one with Salman Khan as well, as a little girl from Punjab. And then, the other one when you actually work with him, your first film.
Yeah, I was just somewhere very intrigued with life one day, and I just was clearing my pictures and I saw this picture. I was like, oh my God, my uncle was a film director. And in our summer holidays, he was announcing a film with Salman. And I said, okay, I have to attend this Muhurat. Maybe, just maybe Salman just, notices me and says, okay, we got our heroine for the next film. But, daydreams have no limitations. You can just daydream anything. But so I was like, I stood right in front of Salman, but he didn't take notice of me. So I was very dejected and heartbroken. So I actually had to use my uncle's, I had to pull strings, and I told my uncle, listen, please tell him to click a picture with me. And so that's that picture. He's looking pretty like in his shot and okay, kheecho aur jao. And so, yeah, my dreams just went kaput after that. And then years later, I did a film with him, and I was so excited. I'm finally shooting with Salman. And they told me, you're playing his sister. So I was again heartbroken, but I thought, okay, I'll give it my best. Maybe I'll be his heroine someday. I never became his heroine, but I think there was a bond that we had, a beautiful one. He's always been, I think he's one of the finest co-actors one can have. So I was just seeing how it is of coming to somebody's shoot, wanting to be right in front of his eyes, actually working with him. Right. And then now, yes, having a certain bond. Life is, I think, intriguing with surprises, with various phases that it has for you, where आपके जो रिश्ते होते हैं वो हर इंसान के साथ हर फेज में बदल जाते हैं. Or wahi, I think, is what I'm highlighting in the book as well, where I have seen different people from my point of view as a common person, as a newcomer, as an actor who has been their co-star, and as somebody who knows them personally. So all of them have been so different. And I think everyone tells us this is a book also for newcomers, because we kind of learn how it is when you come in, how you enter into an industry which is like, can be unnerving. It might be unnerving because you come with no support system as such. So for me, it was trial and error learning. I used to just carry my pictures everywhere, and and nobody says no in the industry, nobody, because you might be needed anytime. So I called up my mother one fine day and said, Mom, I'm doing 22 films. I'm a busy girl. And none of them started actually. So it's like you come of your own. You have to look over yourself, and somewhere you find your own kind of people, your own niche, your kind of movies, your kind of work that you want to do.
And that's why I love the OTT explosion, Divya, because I mean, just good actors, good writing, great stories. It's such a wonderful time at present. And with actors like you working right now, it's always inspiring as a writer, always.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. No, but I think I started a bit early from Bir Zara because that time these unconventional roles were not so welcome. It was either you are the film's heroine or you are the side actor. There was no in-betweens. These days that line has diminished. It's only good roles and not so good roles. So yeah, that time I remember my mother said, so you think you're a good actor? I said, yes, of course. So she said, so what are you waiting for? I said, I'm waiting for somebody to just find me and make a film for me. So she said, that's not happening. You take roles that come your way and make them so beautiful, make them so your own that people can't ignore you and they write for you. And very strangely, Advaita, that has happened in these years, that after Veer Zara, I mean, with such a multi-star cast where I would think I probably wouldn't even be seen, people still remember me for that film. For Dilli Che, a multi-starrer again, but everyone, they kind of bind you with images. I'm enjoying this process of breaking those images and moving on to a very different role with each film. I think I'm loving that journey, and I'm loving the people who are seeing me differently, and enjoying this process.
Absolutely. It's very interesting what you're saying, Divya, because I think you share something very important with Zora. She never turned down a single role, no matter how small it was. And when she was in England, particularly, she only ever had supporting roles. I mean, of course, she was very much older than you are. She was in her 50s when she actually arrived there. So she was no young hopeful. But one of the decisions she made, and as I said, this is what was so important when actually looking behind the scenes, one of the decisions she made was she would never turn down a role. Now, it was that continuous exposure, however small the role, that actually enabled her to keep her hand in. And then what happened with her, as I'm sure it will happen with you, roles were written for her.
Yes.
She became so critical in what she did and how she transformed that small role into something so sort of riveting on screen that roles began to be written for her. This was very important. This became like, it became something, what could have been a disadvantage became her calling card.
Absolutely.
And that ability to not think of yourself as the leading star, to see yourself as the actor, whatever the role, not as the star, but as the actor, is what separated her from, say, someone like Madhu Jaffrey, who was also in television and film at the same time as Zora. But Madhu left because she wasn't getting the kinds of roles she wanted. She left. She just, she didn't act after a point. Zora never turned a role down. And then when she came back, and she was, of course, she said, I've spent 8 years with Dada, with Uday Shankar, and 14 years with Prithviraj, and 20 years in Britain with all these big names. And people only remember me because maine Govinda ko ek thappad lagai. So, but the point was that they remembered the thappad. I mean, it would have been an insignificant moment, but they remembered it. So this business of small role is very interesting.
It is, but see, like you said, she added her own passion, her own best to it. That's
She
very
did.
important. You can't just take any role
Yes,
for granted
quite
and say,
right,
okay,
quite
I'm doing
right.
it, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I also always thought of myself as an actor. It's just that things around me changed. Now, as you said, things are happening
Yes.
this way that now,
Yeah.
without my making any conscious effort, there are lead roles written for me.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I didn't change anything. I was doing what I was doing. I think things changed.
Yes.
The perception of people changed itself. So yeah, I
I
guess
think
you
the
just have,
perception of women changes actually.
yes, absolutely.
Not
That's
just the
true.
role, but the perception of women. I
Women
think.
has changed.
For
True.
me, as a writer, I mean, I always visualize women. So you've been warned, Divya, but I definitely visualized
I would
Vidya
love
in,
to.
I definitely visualized Vidya in Kahani. And
Yes.
it it's important for a writer to do that. In fact, now when I met Mr. Bachchan after Kahani released, and initially when I was writing, I thought of a character for him in the film, but it didn't evolve in quite that way. So when I
Right.
met him, I said, I'm so and so, and I actually wrote out a character for you in Kahani, but it didn't evolve in that way. And he turned around, the living legend, and he says, "Oh, thank you so much. Maybe next time that
Yeah.
that I'm speaking to a writer, so maybe next time there'll be a role for me. I was just so moved by that.
But talking about Mr. Bachchan, I remember, I must share this anecdote with you. He actually was one of the reasons I joined the films, as were many others, I guess, because I was like, who is this man? He just takes over the whole screen. He just owns it beautifully with that amazing presence of his. And so when I came into the industry and I did my first film with him, which is called Bhagwan, I was playing a mean character in that. I somehow didn't know how to detach myself from the real and the real. So I used to go back home very depressed. And normally I would say a very chirpy good morning to him every day. Good morning, sir, and everything. But gradually I started sulking. And he was so sharp, he was so sensitive that he realized something's wrong with this kid. And one fine day he called me, he says, Suniye, you are not doing a very nice thing with me. You're being very mean to me. I suddenly was so defensive. I said, sir, but this is just a role. And there was a pause. And he had said he made me realize what I didn't by not saying anything. And so he treated me, he pampered me with Allahabadi gachaks and all that stuff. At his stature, why he's called an institution is not just because he's a brilliant actor or a superstar. I think also these things that matter, that to date, I reminisce those memories and those incidents and say, Mr. Bachchan didn't need to see a newcomer feeling, sulking away in a corner. He made an effort to brighten up my life, and it still does to date. So I think that's the magnanimity of Mr. Bachchan.
My aunt Madhu Sharma is watching, and she wants to ask you, Divya, what was working on Bhag Milkha Singh Bhag like?
Most magical experience we've had. Some films have something magical happening all the time. In this film, none of us used glycerine. I must talk about this very famous scene that we did. Was the earring scene, which everyone loves, where the brother comes back after many years and he gets those little earrings that she had, so he brings those earrings back for her. So we had the script, we had the scene, but we didn't know how. So Mr. Mehra said, add your own beginning to it and add your own end to it. So Farhan said, okay, I will come in, I'll wear those dark glasses and come. I said, okay, so I will not recognize you. I was wearing my jeans and my shirt, normal t-shirt. There was something amiss in my performance. I didn't know what was happening. And Mr. Mehra said, why don't you go and change into your costume? That day, Advaita, I realized the power of the costume. I came back in salwar kameez. I just covered my head with the dupatta. My body language changed. I did nothing about it. It just changed. And then we had the beginning with us. Now I was hugging Farhan and I was like thinking that time कि ये तो बड़ा क्लीशे हो जाएगा कि मैंने इसको hug किया रोके मैं क्या और क्या कर सकती हूँ ये action हो रहा है ये चल रहा है उस time कर रहे हैं. This is not rehearsed. This is during the take. And I was surprised that we all have a subconscious, but even the character you're playing has a subconscious was a thing I discovered that day. I suddenly remembered that Isri Kaur, when we had just shot a scene where Isri and Milkha's father salutes Milkha when they were small, and we had just shot it a month back. And suddenly I just left the embrace and I just did that salute thing. Everyone was like, "Ye kahan se aaya?" मुझे भी नहीं पता वो कहाँ से आया, but वो आया, and it just changed the scene, and I was left flabbergasted कि ये कहाँ से निकला. So these are the magic things that happen whilst you're acting with actors you love, with the script you love, with the directors you love, who just help you grow. So yeah, that is for your aunt. Yes.
In lovely story. What a lovely story.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. Thank you.
I like this thing, the actor's subconscious. It's very intuitive. And I remember Zora saying to me, कि भाई कई दफा in Guru, for example, she said, script में तो कुछ था ही नहीं. मैंने कहा मैं अपने आप ही कर लेती हूँ. Now that's exactly what you talk about, the actor's subconscious. And so she said, I just made up some gibberish. बम्बैया हिंदी किसी को तो पता ही नहीं थी वहां पे. अब लंदन में बम्बैया हिंदी किसको कौन जानता है, किसी को कुछ पता ही नहीं. I just made up a lot of gibberish and I said it. And of course, that scene then becomes, like your scene, memorable. So it is wonderful. It is magical. This business of being able to create without rehearsing. Lucky to be able to do that.
I just feel it's amazing to live somebody else's life for that little while and just feel what they feel. Yes.
It is. It is. Yeah. But I think we all are lucky to be able to do that, to either live that life or to be able to write it or recreate it, or somehow put yourself in their shoes, to imagine it, to begin to put words in their mouth.
Yes.
That too is, and since I must say it's been lovely, the three of us talking, but, and I do think that three women talking is very different from three men talking, or two women and one man, and so on. And I'm saying it openly and publicly.
Yeah. We would be talking over each other if it was three men.
Maybe. I don't know, but I think we listen. We listen to each other in a very different way. It's not just talking, but listening.
Yes.
Oh, yes, that's the thing. Thank you. Thanks.
And of course, she writes about Zaira Sehgal that she was absolutely brilliant in the ones I was lucky to have watched, and she says she has watched a few only. Then there's Professor Chandrasekhar who asks, what was Zohra's opinion about partition?
Of the family, only Zohra, her sister Hajra, who was part of the Communist Party, and her father stayed back because they were nationalists. The other siblings all left for Pakistan. So in Zohra's case, we must remember that she was in Lahore before partition, and she was married to a Hindu. This was an interfaith marriage. So her situation was somewhat different from her siblings. Plus, she was in a city that was already beginning to feel the sort of let's say the ripples between the ripples of antagonism between the communities. So she and Kameshwar decided that it would not be possible for them to continue in Lahore, and they then went to Bombay. This was actually before partition. So it was in 44 or 45, but they had already begun to feel that there was something in the air, because of course, all that the Pakistan movement had already begun, and Lahore was one of the centers. When the division actually took place, I think that she, her father, and the sister who were here felt like that it was an absolutely personally, but also politically, a point of no return. It took her years and years to go back to go and visit her relatives in Pakistan. And mind you, we forget now, but up until the mid-50s, there was no restriction to movement. Anyone could go back and forth across the borders. There was absolutely no restriction, but she didn't. So I think that for her, personally as well as otherwise, partition did become something very, very critical.
Okay. He also asks, did Zohra talk about casting couch anytime?
No. But you must remember that when Zohra entered film, she was in her 50s. She was not a young woman. And she was, when she was in film in India, she was the choreographer, never the actor. But she did say, and she said this openly, that she thought that the Bombay film industry, in the Bombay film industry, the role of the dancer was that of a vamp, and not of an artist. She said this very openly, and that is why she actually preferred not to act in Bombay cinema. So she was the choreographer in Shakuntala and in one or two other films. She was the choreographer, never the dancer herself, except very early in one. And when she was in England, when she did enter television and film, she was already in her mid-50s. I don't think that the question of casting couch would have arisen in her case. What she did talk about was the racism in Britain at the time and how it was very, very difficult for a non-white to get a good role. And she was not the only one. I mentioned Madhur. Madhur Jaffrey was one of the few who left because she said there were no roles written for non-whites. There were many actors at the time in England who said this in no uncertain terms, that very, very often the roles for non-white actors were played by whites. I mean, look at Peter Sellers playing that.
The party.
So yes, and on television this was very common. Waris Hussain says that it was routine for whites to be playing non-whites, to be playing Pakistanis, Indians, Africans, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, but never casting someone from that part of the world in the role. So the racism was definitely something she encountered.
There is some more fan mail for Divya. And after that, there is one question which I think actually I should ask Advaita. Can we expect good female-centric movies in Bollywood in near future? Because as of now, it is glam doll heroines.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm definitely one of those writers who's going to continue, is committed to it and to writing those kind of roles. The issue is getting them greenlit. That's the problem.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I remember even with Kahani, it was quite a struggle to get it off the ground, but things have improved dramatically. That's why I'm so happy about OTTs, you know, because they just open doors. And I mean, I wanted to ask, Zora would have loved this time, right? Had she been around?
Yeah, that's why she continued acting. I mean,
no, but I mean the OTT explosion, the web
she would have, if there were roles for her, she would never have turned them down, never. And I think that right in the end, till she found it difficult to move, actually. But then, as she always said, "Chehra to hai, awaaz to hai."
There is a bonding that takes place. There is a calm comfort that exists in respecting each other. I think that was a wonderful session. And thank you, Advaita, for conducting it so well. And Divya, love to have you here. And Ritu, so nice to hear you, especially about my favorite Zohra. It was a very,
Thank
very
you all. Thank you.
good
It's
answer.
lovely to be together. I must say, a most wonderful Sunday morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you for
HMS.
Bye, Advaita. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
full memory.
citizen driven. All of us who have worked to bring this festival out are people from within your all friend circles. We are all citizens and volunteers who have brought this out. HLF rocks, come rain or sunshine, HLF goes on.
Dear friends, welcome to this novel event marked as the interlude of the 12th edition of Hyderabad Literary Festival, The Art of Hand Shadowgraphy with Prashant Rao. We have all been fascinated by shadows at some point or the other in our childhood. Why, even in our adulthood? Shadows of objects, of ourselves, under the moonlight, sunlight, table lamps, candlelights, torches. It is fascinating how the strength and distance from the light can change the intensity, size, and shape of shadows Then there are people who narrate spooky stories, create fearsome characters and ambience as they experiment with their shadows and stories. What fun. Prashant Rao learned hand shadowgraphy, the art of making shadows with one's hands, by watching his father, Prasanna Rao, who was a sensitive and fine artist and a very well-known shadowgrapher in Europe. Prashant must have witnessed his father perform thousands of times before the audiences of all ages around the entire world. Prasanna Rao performed this art for over 6 decades and was known as the Prince of Shadows. Prasanna Rao Garu would accompany his show by singing songs by Rabindranath Tagore as he created magic with his bare hands. Born and brought up in Germany, Prashant would accompany his father through his travels and continues the tradition set by his father, performing when he has the opportunity. Prashant currently works as an engineer in Bangalore. We will screen the 15 minutes video prepared by Prashant Rao and then call him back on stage screen for a brief conversation to wrap up the program in 30 minutes. There is, dear friends, a small surprise too. Hold on, sit tight, and watch as the events unfold.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this hand shadow performance. My name is Prashant Rao, and accompanying me today is a character, is a person, Dr. Hijbich. And Dr. Hijbich is a character with a bit of a twist. He's got a bit of a tangent, though he's made up completely and only of 2 hands, Hij and Bij. And let's now join Dr. Hijbich on a little journey. Shankachero Bhuvalata Nijariya Poman Shankachero Kalpana Te Hoina Briyamana Ha 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 Muktakara Bhoy Lalili Lili Lalili Lili Lalili Lili Lala Ha 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 Dharma Jabe Shankarabe Korbe Ahavan Nirabhay Namray Pan Kariya Pran Muktakara Bhoy Apna Maj Shakti Dhara Nijarikara Joya Ha 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 Shankachero Bhuvalata Nijariya Puman Shankachero Kalpana Te Hoina Briyamana Ha 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 Dharma Jabe Shankarabe Korbe Ahavan Nirabhay Namray Pankariya Pran Muktakara Bhoy Apna Maj Shakti Dhara Nijarikara Joya Ha 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 Shankachero Bhuvalata Nijariya Puman Shankachero Kalpana Te Hoina Briyamana Ha 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 Dharma Jabe Shankarabe Korbe Ahavan Nirabhay Namrabhay Pankariya Pran Muktakara Bhoy Apna Maj Shakti Dhara Nijarikara Joya Ha 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 Shankachero Bhuvalata Nijariya Puman Shankachero Kalpana Te Hoina Briyamana Ha 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 Dharma Jabe Shankarabe Korbe Ahavan Mo Nirabhay Namrabhay Pankariya Pran Muktakara Bhoy Apna Maj Shakti Dhara Nijarikara Joya Banana Mustache Shankachero Bhuvalata Nijariya Puman Shankachero Kalpana Te Hoina Briyamana Ha 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 Dharma Jabe Shankarabe Korbe Ahavan President Donald Trump Dharma Jabe Shankarabe Korbe Ahavan Nirabhay Namrabhay Pankariya Pran Muktakara Bhoy अपना माज शक्तिधर निजरे करो जय सिगार grande havana pong धर्म जाबे शंकर राबे करबे आह्वान निर्भय नम्र হয় পণ করিয়া প্রাণ মুক্ত কর ভয় अपना माज शक्तिधर निजरे करो जय हा 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 শঙ্কচের বিহলতা নিজরে আপমান महात्मा गांधी শঙ্কচের কল্পনাতে হয় না প্রিয়মান হা 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 ধর্ম যাবে শঙ্কর হবে করবে আহ্বান নির্ভয় নম্র হয় পণ করিয়া eaten too much drank too much Pinocchio, 100 years old. ধর্ম যাবে শঙ্কর হবে করবে আহ্বান নির্ভয় নম্র হয় পণ করিয়া প্রাণ মুক্ত কর ভয় अपना মাঝ শক্তিধর আচু 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 Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Tired, sleepy, Dino joy, Dino joy, Dino joy. Dino joy. Stop! Silence! পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে পাগল আমার মন জেগে উঠে পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে mountains and mountains and mountains Mount Fujiyama from Japan পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে পাগল আমার মন জেগে উঠে in the mountains a cave and in the cave a little rat. Pagla Hawaii badol dine, pagol amar mon jege uthe. Chena shonar kon baire, jekhane pot nai nai je, shekhane okarone jai chute. Pagla Hawaii badol dine. Pagla Hawaii badol dine, pagol amar mon jege uthe. চেনা সোনার কোন বাহিরে পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে পাগল আমার মন জেগে উঠে 4 rabbits পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে father rabbit and a mother rabbit and 2 children 1 and 2 4 rabbits পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে পাগল আমার মন জেগে উঠে চেনা সোনার কোন বাহিরে যেখানে পথ নাই নাই যে সেখানে ও কারণে যায় ছুটে পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে পাগল আমার মন জেগে উঠে বৃষ্টি নেশা ভরা সন্ধ্যা বেলা কোন বলে রামে রামি চেরা আমার স্বপ্ন ঘিরে নাচে মাতাল জুতে নাচে মাতাল জুতে পাগলা হাওয়ায় বাদল দিনে a llama with a fly flies gone, llamas also gone. Hero shagorute torongia. Hero shagorute torongia. As the south wind blows over the sea, waves come up, and the poet sings. Look at that beautiful sea. Hero shagorute torongia. Sea has also dangerous crocodiles. Ah, Hero shagorute torongia. Ah, batash pohevingi. Hero shagorute torongia. And beautiful swans. Shujututayos tinai. Jilikimare mege. Hero shagorute torongia. Dokine chai tore chai fenai. Ah, kitchenai, jaboy. Ami jaboy, ami jaboy. Shajiani he juhaj khani boshia hajardari. Kon purite rapna bodie kon shagor pari. Kon ke chai lok kori ale. Apu. Jaboy, ami jaboy. Jaboy, ami jaboy. Oh! Ding 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 ding. Oh! Ding 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 ding. Oh! Ding ding ding. Oh! Ding 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 ding. Kiliki ding ding kiliki ding ding kiliki. Ding 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 ding. Ta ding 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 ding. A forest. Black forest. Ding 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 ding. In the forest is a house. Ding 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 ding. Ta ding 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 ding. And in the house a festival. Ding ding ding. Dum dum dum. Ding 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 ding. Dum dum dum. Ding ding ta ding ding ta ding ding ta ding ta ding 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 ding. Ding ding ta ding ta ding ta ding. Ding ding ta ding ta ding ta ding. Ding ding ta ding ta ding ta ding. The man ding ding ta ding ta ding. The man has a hat. The lady a diamond ear ornament, sparkling and shining. Ding 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 ding. I hope you enjoyed the performance, the show of hand shadowgraphy. This show was actually created and done by my father, Prashant Rao, who was known as the Prince of Shadows. He was born in 1919. He studied in Shantiniketan, and he was self-taught in the art of hand shadowgraphy. He actually learned it as a child on his own, taught himself, just because he was unwell much of the time, and for company he had a lamp and a wall, a little candle and a wall, and he used to make these figures. And one day a relative came in and said and showed him a figure, and my father told him that it doesn't quite look right. So he was scolded by his parents in turn that, you know, if you're criticizing somebody, make sure that you can do it better. That was a challenge to him, and that's what he did. So he used to create these hand shadow shows. He performed across the world at various different events in front of many different personalities and celebrities, and he passed on the art to me, and I try to do as much as I can to make it look as nice as possible as he could do. So I thought I could share a couple of examples, or show you a couple of shadows, some things easy that you can do. The important thing here is to always keep looking at the shadow of what you've created, because everybody's hands are slightly different, right? So I can show you something with my hands, but the way it will look with your fingers, with your hands, with your light. So you have to look not at your hands so much, but more at the shadow. So let's take a look at a dog, for example. Now, one way of doing a dog is you just pull in your first finger and then open the mouth a little bit like that. Now, if you want to give your dog a little bit of texture, just watch my hand. and we do this, and that gives us our dog a little bit more texture and more form. And this woof woof can be your dog. So just remember that. The first finger, pull it back, open up, and then just look at the form and see how you can make it nice. Right, now I can show you a bird. So this is, many books will have this, you'll see this also. Just you make a fist, hold it to yourself, then take out your first finger and your thumb, and you create the beak in the head of the bird. You can add on a tail, and have the bird. Play with your bird, how much ever you'd like. Quite enjoyable. And you can make it fly away and bring it back again. And that's your little bird. In a similar way, a little more complicated, if you turn this down like this, and then pull up the two other fingers, your middle finger and your ring finger, you get your rabbit. And then you twist it a little bit, so that makes it look good. Give it some grass to run over, and there you have a little rabbit. That also you can play with how much you like. You can make it run on this side of the grass, you can make it run across to the other side if you can, and bring it back again. And you can make it talk if you like. And this is a little rabbit. I hope you enjoyed the performance. I hope you enjoyed this. And all the best for 2022. Thank you so much.
Welcome, Prashant, and thank you for this wonderful show. I don't think Hyderabad has seen anything like this before. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Amita. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. And thanks to the audience as well. You were a wonderful audience.
Thank you.
Despite virtually. The best so far.
I know. But I mean, who has ever seen this? And this is so unusual. And tell us, actually, this is such an unusual art form. Tell us a little bit about how your father got into it and this art and this entire artistic inclination that he's had.
Yeah, so he was always artistic, but he started this off by himself as a little child. He was often unwell, and he'd be in a little room and typically dark and with a candle or a light, and he'd try things out himself. Once an elderly relative came by and showed him a couple of things, and as a little child he said, that doesn't look like a dog or like that character, and he was scolded for that. Saying you can't criticize unless you do it better, and he took it up. He then went on, he studied fine arts in Shantiniketan, Rabindranath Tagore's institute, and but he kept this. He was an art teacher, but he kept doing this. He would perform, and one thing led to another, and he started then performing professionally. He left being an art teacher and then traveled the world performing in this way. And so the technique is completely his own. He refined it, and all the studies on his fingers is completely through his own imagination, and it's through his own ability.
Wonderful. And now you have this legacy which must be held on to and documented and carried forward. Thank you for doing that. But I also heard you sing along while you were performing. Is this also part of the legacy that your father has given over to you?
Yes, absolutely. So this was Rabindra Sangeet, so in Bengali, and that was due to, of course, my father having a very close connection to Rabindranath Tagore and Shantiniketan. And this was exactly the show that he would perform. So he was actually he would perform in the, he traveled through many countries. He did have a performance that had actual, orchestra music, a band playing along. And after a while, that just became a bit, there was a lot of overhead. And one of the show producers that he was working with asked him, can you do something just, very simple and of course reflecting Indian culture in some way? And he thought about it and just made this show. And I have tried variations, but I keep coming back to this. This was exactly the way he would perform it.
Oh, how nice. How
A few
wonderful.
figures here and there are slightly different, but yeah.
Right, right. And you can practically do everything with your hands, right?
Completely.
Bare hands. There's nothing else.
There's nothing else. No props, no other props. Sometimes, of course, you can have the bird play with a pair of spectacles or something like that. You can do that, but otherwise, no props.
Yeah. I see a light at the back behind you. Is that something that's part of your equipment?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, this is the same lamp my father used.
Oh.
It's probably 60, 70 years old. There are a lot of stories about this lamp. But
Tell
for
us
those,
one or two.
yeah, invariably, there are quirks in this. So it's like a living thing. We have to take care of it.
Oh.
Because, of course, in the beginning of a show, if the lamp doesn't work, there's no show.
Yeah.
So let's see. There we go. It is working. It is a 12 volt, 100 watt halogen bulb. And this was something also that my father experimented with, came to. Well, oftentimes, on stage, people producing would wonder, why this lamp? Why not take something bigger, more powerful? The bigger the lamp, the larger the filament, the more unclear the shadows.
Oh.
Right. So it comes down to this. So invariably, you'd go through that discussion with producers, with stage, technical people, but we'd always come back to this lamp.
And you have inherited it and you take it with you whenever you perform. Do you perform? What is your trajectory now in this field? I know you're an engineer and you're working full time, but how do you occupy yourself in this field?
Yeah, whenever I given an opportunity like this, I'd perform. I've performed also with a group in Germany, one of the groups that my father used to perform with. They called me back in 2020. So did nearly 30 or 40 performances on weekends and evenings. This is the show I'm looking forward to doing more. There are multiple things, of course, now with also some level of digital technology or maybe, projection technology, we can experiment a bit more, we can try things out. But also the analog nature of this is also something that lures, has its own charm and appeal. So I'll be trying out different characters, different people, maybe over time.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's great. Well, thank you so much. Is there a particular story that you'd like to share about learning this and your father and your mother? And is there something that you would like to share?
Sure. Well, learning, I grew up backstage. I grew up while my father was, performing. I was watching the performances. I'd watch all the other shows, all the other artists as well, but I'd watch my father's show as well. Sometimes I'd help out backstage. I learned completely from watching. And he'd pull me on stage sometimes. It was funny at times, as artist children, that was a special day when you're allowed to go on stage. We'd talk with the director and ask them. And then, dressed up and brought on stage and doing a little show. So the first thing I did with my father was actually with the birds, and there's this poem, Two Little Dicky Birds. So I do that with the two birds and perform that. And, one flies away, the other flies away, they come back. That was kind of the first performance I did.
Oh, how nice. How old were you then?
I was probably five years old.
Oh, lovely. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to let the audience in on a little secret that I may not have known Prashant when he was 5, but I definitely knew him by the time he was 6 or 7. And I'd love to use this opportunity to call in Nalini Auntie, because I have never called him Prasanna Rao Garu, but I've always called him Uncle. And I would like to let the audience know that this is history that we have to document and hold on to. And here is Nalini Auntie, who can tell us a little bit about how was it, Auntie? And thank you for joining in. I know it's not easy and Prashant is not there, and somehow we've technically put it together. Wonderful that we can do so technically as well. But it has been a great fortune to know you and Uncle for the past, 50 years. And I recall Uncle sort of showing these to us, right? Either at your home or anywhere else that we were, and engaging us as children in this passion that he had with light and shadows. And obviously Prashant has that prasadam that he got from both his parents and his father. Auntie, do tell us about the journey. Do tell us how Uncle's journey, your journey as you did performances all across the world. How did you live? How did you perform? How were those years?
Those years were very nice, but we lived in suitcases. And it was like even I enjoyed it very much, the show and also my husband's company, and also meeting all other different people, and they're learning about the art and the different personalities. It's a different world altogether. So it's never these little things matter to them, nothing. They're just happy performing. They hear the claps and they're happy. And that's what I think is the great about the artists. They perform.
And you lived out of a suitcase, you say. So how was that? Literally out of a suitcase, right?
Yes, it's everything. Winter clothes, summer clothes, everything together.
And you would perform from one, you will go from one place to the other?
One place to another, yes. We never unpacked anything. It was all packed. And when the next call will come, we never know. So it is always his show bag is ready, our overnight bag is ready, toothbrushes are ready. It's always the call comes, Rao come, 2 hours is your flight. So we just run.
And then what? 2 hours flight, and then where do you reach? What happens then?
Yeah, then we go to the hotel and see the stage and work out the rehearsals. And that's all. Sometimes it's a big production. Then it's a rehearsals go on for the whole night. Sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning we go to sleep, and morning again 7, 8, 10 o'clock again we have to be on the stage. So this was a busy life. Like
I can imagine. Yeah,
it was enjoying.
And what was the equipment? What did you carry? You said that he always kept his equipment in the bag ready. What
Yes,
was this?
he carried his lamp and his 2 stands, his transformer, his costume, and a screen he used to carry on his shoulder.
I see.
So that's all. That's all he needed. His 10 fingers, of course. We had to be very careful that he doesn't injure anywhere. He doesn't have any injuries anywhere, and his hands are okay. So he never carried any heavy things or anything. And whenever he cut something, he would be always worried that he will not cut his finger.
Yeah. And tell me, is there anybody else that he saw do the shadowgraphy? Is there anyone else who does shadowgraphy?
No, not of this quality. They do, some of them try for hobby. There was one person who spent some time with him. But it is not as original as like him. Because I remember when he's moving his rabbit, and he sometimes is jumping, and I say, how do you do it? It looks like you are going in the train. So you moving your body. So no, I used to travel in the train to have that movement. So he will watch from the window how the train is moving, how he is going up and down like that, and how his shadows are moving. His hands are not moving. His body is moving. And so that was all, and very minute observations he had. And he was very quick like that to get to grasp the shapes. And anything that came must come straight forward, not like that. Try these pieces. Like this it is coming. And that made him the best world. Because he experienced everything that he did. So okay, the bird is moving, then he'll watch the bird and get the neck movements correctly. Also the swan when it's moving. All this, he observed everything and he tried everything correctly. So he just didn't say, oh no, this is okay, but he perceived
Yes.
till then.
Yes. Yes. I recall him as one of the finest artists. The very first, in fact, I did not know many artists as a child. Of course, in fact, I may not have known any, but he was the first and probably the finest in the last 30 years that I have worked in this profession. One of the finest artists that one can meet. Knew his art well, humble to the core. And I'm so glad that you accompanied him and made this possible. And I am very, very thankful, Prashant, that you carry on this tradition. I think this calls for a longer session with Prashant and Auntie. Thank you both for being with us at the Hyderabad Literary
Thank
Festival.
you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very
to
much
all
and
the
for
audience
giving
as
me an
well.
opportunity. I have nothing of the art in me.
You have passed it on to Prashant.
To
Thank you so
Prashant,
much
yes.
and goodbye.
Thank you so much, Amita. And
Thank
take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You need us to leave?